The day Evelyn Carter's pride shattered wasn't the day she lost her fortune. It was the day she was sold like cattle to a man who couldn't even write his own name. In 1847, Red Hollow, a town where reputation meant survival, one woman's fall from grace became a spectacle no one would forget. What happens when a banker's daughter, raised on silk and superiority, is forced to marry a stable hand covered in dirt and shame? This is a story of pride, punishment, and the unexpected power found in the most unlikely places. Stay with me until the end, hit that like button, and comment what city you're watching from so I can see how far this story travels. The morning of October 14th, 1847, began like any other in the Carter household, with the illusion of permanence. Evelyn Carter stood before her vanity mirror, her reflection framed by imported French wallpaper and gaslight sconces that cost more than most families in Red Hollow earned in a year. Her fingers worked through her copper-brown hair with practiced efficiency, twisting it into an elegant chignon that would survive the day's social calls. At 23, she had perfected the art of looking effortlessly refined, a skill her mother had drilled into her since childhood. "Miss Evelyn, your father requests you join him for breakfast," Martha, the housemaid, announced from the doorway, her voice carrying that peculiar mix of deference and familiarity that came from years of service. "Tell him I'll be down momentarily," Evelyn replied, securing the last pin in her hair. She chose a day dress of deep emerald silk, expensive, but not ostentatiously so. There was an art to displaying wealth in a frontier town. Too little, and you were dismissed as common. Too much, and you were resented. Evelyn had learned to walk that line with precision. The Carter home occupied the corner of Main Street and Prospect Avenue, a two-story testament to financial success in a town that barely remembered what trees looked like before they'd all been cut down for building. William Carter had built his banking empire on the desperation of miners, ranchers, and merchants who needed capital to survive the unforgiving frontier. It was a respectable business, Evelyn told herself, even if the interest rates made strong men weep. She descended the staircase with her hand barely touching the polished mahogany banister, her posture impeccable. In the dining room, her father sat behind a wall of newspapers, his coffee growing cold beside him. "Good morning, Father." William Carter lowered his paper just enough to acknowledge her presence. At 56, he wore his success like armor, tailored suits, gold watch chain, hair pomaded into submission. But this morning, Evelyn noticed something different in his expression. A tightness around his eyes, a muscle working in his jaw. "Evelyn, sit." She took her usual seat, accepting tea from Martha while studying her father's face. "Is something wrong?" "Judge Blackwell's son called yesterday evening, after you'd retired." William folded his newspaper with deliberate care. "He wished to know if you'd reconsidered his proposal." Evelyn's stomach tightened. "I see. And what did you tell him?" "I told him I would speak with you." He finally met her eyes. "Evelyn, Thomas Blackwell is a fine match. He's educated from an excellent family." "He's a drunk and a bully," Evelyn interrupted, her voice sharp. "I've seen how he treats the servers at the hotel, how he speaks to anyone he considers beneath him." "He's the judge's son," William said, his voice hardening. "In a town like Red Hollow, that means something." "It means his father has power to ruin people's lives from the bench," Evelyn countered. "It doesn't mean Thomas has any character worth admiring." The silence that followed felt like a physical presence in the room. Martha had disappeared into the kitchen, wisely removing herself from the conversation. William Carter set down his coffee cup with controlled precision. "I had hoped you would see reason on your own, but perhaps you need to understand the reality of our situation more clearly." Something in his tone made Evelyn's pulse quicken. "What do you mean?" "The bank has been facing certain challenges. The silver mine investment I mentioned last spring, the one you said would triple our holdings? It failed." William's face had gone slightly gray. "Catastrophically. The vein ran out in August, the mining company dissolved, and I had leveraged significant portions of our assets to finance the operation." Evelyn felt the room tilt slightly. "How significant?" "Nearly everything." The words hung in the air like smoke. Evelyn's hands had gone numb around her teacup. "But the house, your business, mortgaged, both of them," William's voice had taken on a hollow quality. To Judge Blackwell, among others. I needed capital to cover the losses before word spread, before there was a run on the bank. Father, what have you done? What I had to do to keep us from losing everything. His voice cracked slightly, a sound Evelyn had never heard before. Do you know what happens to bankers who fail in towns like this? We'd be driven out, penniless. Your mother would be... He stopped himself. The humiliation alone would kill her. Evelyn's mother, Victoria, was currently visiting her sister in San Francisco, or so Evelyn had been told. Now she wondered if that was even true, or if her mother had been sent away to avoid the coming storm. The judge has offered a solution, William continued, his voice steadier now, calculated. A merger of families. Thomas takes you as his wife, and the debt is forgiven. We maintain our position. The bank survives. You want to sell me? Evelyn's voice was barely a whisper. I want to save this family. By treating me like livestock, William slammed his hand on the table, making the china rattle. By making the only choice available to us. Do you think I enjoy this? Do you think I want to see my daughter married to Thomas Blackwell? But pride is a luxury we can no longer afford. Evelyn stood, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor. I won't do it. I won't marry him. Then you condemn us all. William's face had gone from gray to red. Is that what you want? To see everything we've built destroyed because you're too proud to make a sacrifice? A sacrifice? Evelyn's laugh was bitter. You're asking me to spend my life with a man I despise, to bear his children, to smile and pretend I chose this, and you call it a sacrifice, as if it's some noble deed? What I'm asking you to do is grow up, William roared, rising from his seat. The frontier doesn't care about your preferences, your pride, or your romantic notions. It breaks people, Evelyn. It crushes them. And the only ones who survive are those willing to make hard choices. The argument might have continued, escalating into territory neither could return from, but Martha appeared in the doorway, her face pale. Mr. Carter, sir, there are men here to see you. From the bank. William's anger drained away instantly, replaced by something that looked like fear. Who sent them? They say it's official business, sir. They have papers. Father and daughter exchanged a look, the first moment of shared understanding they'd had all morning. Whatever was about to happen, it was worse than their argument. The men waiting in the foyer were not the usual banking associates Evelyn was accustomed to seeing. These were harder specimens, the kind hired to collect debts from people who couldn't or wouldn't pay. 3 of them, dressed in dark suits that barely concealed the weapons at their sides. The leader, a man with a scar bisecting his left eyebrow, tipped his hat to Evelyn with exaggerated courtesy. Miss Carter, lovely as always. His eyes said he found her anything but lovely, or rather, that her loveliness was irrelevant to his purpose. State your business, William demanded, trying to summon the authority he'd wielded for decades. Judge Blackwell's compliments, Mr. Carter. The scarred man produced a folded document from his coat. He's asked me to deliver this notice personally. Seems young Thomas shared some unfortunate news with his father last night. About Miss Carter's decision. Evelyn felt ice settle in her stomach. William took the paper with trembling hands. As he read, the color drained from his face entirely. This can't be legal. I have until the end of the month. Had until the end of the month, the man corrected. That was contingent on the proposed arrangement, which, as I understand it, Miss Carter has declined. Judge Blackwell sees no reason to extend further courtesy under the circumstances. But the bank, there are processes, regulations. Judge Blackwell is the regulation in Red Hollow, Mr. Carter. You know that better than anyone. The scarred man's smile didn't reach his eyes. You have until noon to vacate the premises. The house, the bank building, and all associated properties are hereby seized in settlement of debt. You may take personal effects, of course. We're not barbarians. Noon? Evelyn found her voice, though it sounded strange to her own ears. That's less than 3 hours. Then I suggest you start packing, miss. William seemed to have aged 10 years in as many seconds. Please, there must be some accommodation. There is, the scarred man interrupted. Judge Blackwell remains open to the original proposal. Miss Carter accepts young Thomas's hand, and this document becomes void. The debt is forgiven. You keep your home, your business, your position. He turned his cold gaze to Evelyn. All she has to do is say yes. The room felt airless. Evelyn was aware of Martha weeping quietly in the corner, of her father's ragged breathing, of the three men standing like
This story
executioners
was
in the
posted
foyer.
on the channel west of
And if I
Betrayal.
refuse,
Please do not
then
repost
by this
it
time
in any
tomorrow,
form.
you and your father will be on the street with whatever you can carry. The bank will be liquidated, the assets distributed to creditors. Mr. Carter's reputation will be destroyed, not just here, but in every town from here to San Francisco. No one extends credit to a failed banker, Miss Carter. No one trusts them. No one hires them. The man's voice was almost gentle, which made his words more terrible. You'll be destitute, both of you. Evelyn, her father began, but she cut him off with a look. Give us a moment to discuss this, privately. The scarred man checked his pocket watch. You have 10 minutes. We'll be outside. When the door closed behind them, William sank into a chair as if his strings had been cut. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I never imagined he would move this quickly. Because you rejected him before, Evelyn said, her mind working with crystalline clarity despite the chaos of her emotions. Last spring, when Thomas first proposed, you told him I wasn't interested. He's been planning this ever since, hasn't he? Waiting for you to stumble so he could force your hand. William's silence was confirmation enough. Evelyn walked to the window, looking out at the street she'd known her entire adult life. Red Hollow on a Tuesday morning, merchants opening their shops, women with market baskets, a stagecoach rattling past. The ordinary machinery of frontier life, indifferent to her crisis. I won't marry Thomas Blackwell, she said quietly. I can't. I'd rather be poor than spend my life with that man. Then we're ruined. Perhaps we deserve to be. William made a sound between a laugh and a sob. Your mother will never forgive me. She'll... He stopped, his eyes widening. Oh, God, Victoria. He's in San Francisco on my credit. If the bank fails, if my name is destroyed, she'll come home to nothing, Evelyn finished. Yes, I'd already thought of that. The 10 minutes stretched like hours, yet also passed too quickly. When the knock came at the door, neither of them had moved. The scarred man entered without waiting for permission. Well? I need more time, William pleaded. Surely the judge would allow... The judge has been more than generous, Mr. Carter. The answer is simple, yes or no. Does Miss Carter accept Thomas Blackwell's proposal? Evelyn opened her mouth to refuse, to damn them all, to choose poverty and ruin over surrendering to this extortion. Wait! The voice came from the doorway. Judge Blackwell himself stood there, a large man in expensive clothes, his presence filling the room like smoke. I believe there may have been a misunderstanding. William stood so quickly his chair toppled backward. Judge Blackwell, I assure you, I intended to convince her. The judge raised a hand for silence. My son came to me last night quite distraught. He'd offered Miss Carter an honorable proposal, and she'd rejected him with what he described as considerable cruelty. His eyes fixed on Evelyn. Is this true? I told him I didn't wish to marry him, Evelyn said, forcing her voice to remain steady. I didn't realize honesty was now considered cruelty. Honesty without kindness often is, the judge replied. But that's not why I'm here. You see, I've given considerable thought to your situation, and I've realized that perhaps Thomas isn't the right match for you after all. Hope flared in William's eyes. Then you'll extend the deadline. I'll do better than that. Judge Blackwell smiled, and Evelyn felt her skin crawl. I'll offer an alternative arrangement, one that satisfies the debt while acknowledging Miss Carter's preferences. What kind of arrangement? Evelyn asked, though she already knew she wouldn't like the answer. A marriage still, but not to my son. The judge's smile widened. You see, my stable hand has been asking for permission to marry for months now. Simple fellow, barely literate, but a hard worker. I told him he needed to prove himself, save money, establish a proper home, and yesterday it occurred to me that perhaps I'd been making things too difficult for him. The room had gone very quiet. You can't be serious, Evelyn whispered. Oh, but I am. Ethan Cole is in need of a wife. Your father is in need of debt forgiveness. It seems a perfect solution. The judge pulled out another document. I've already drawn up the papers. You marry Ethan, the debt is void. You refuse, and my original timeline stands. Noon, Mr. Carter. Noon to vacate. This is madness, William protested. To marry her to a stable hand, the humiliation is considerably less than total ruin, I should think. Judge Blackwell's voice had gone cold. And it's not negotiable. These are your options, Mr. Carter. Your daughter marries Ethan Cole, or you lose everything. Those are the only choices on this particular table. Evelyn felt as if she were watching the scene from a great distance. A stable hand. A man who shoveled horse manure and slept in the servants' quarters. A man so far beneath her social station that people would laugh at the mere suggestion of a match between them. And yet, the alternative was destitution, the destruction of her family, her mother abandoned in San Francisco with no funds to return home. Why are you doing this? She asked the judge. If you're going to forgive the debt anyway, why force me to marry at all? Why not simply extend mercy? Because mercy without lesson is worthless, Judge Blackwell replied. You insulted my son, Miss Carter. You treated him as if he were beneath you. So now you'll learn what it truly means to marry beneath your station. Consider it an education in humility. This is revenge, Evelyn said flatly. Nothing more. This is justice, and you have 5 minutes to decide. The scarred man checked his watch again, the ticking audible in the silence. Evelyn looked at her father, saw the defeat in his eyes, the gray pallor of his skin. He would not survive total ruin, not just financially, but spiritually. The shame would destroy him. And her mother, proud Victoria Carter, stranded in San Francisco with no money, no prospects, no way home. I need to see him, Evelyn heard herself say. This Ethan Cole. Before I agree to anything, I need to see the man you're selling me to. Judge Blackwell's eyebrows rose slightly. Selling? Such harsh language. I'm merely facilitating a mutually beneficial arrangement. Call it what it is, Evelyn said, her voice hard. You're bartering me like property to punish me for rejecting your son. The least you can do is let me see what I'm being traded for. The judge considered this, then nodded. Fair enough. Bring him in. The scarred man disappeared, returning moments later with a figure that seemed to fill the doorway. Ethan Cole was not what Evelyn had expected. She'd pictured someone bent and brutish, the kind of man who lived his life in stables because he was fit for nothing better. Instead, she found herself looking at a man in his late 20s, tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes the color of winter sky. His clothes were work-worn but clean, his hands calloused but not grotesque. He looked at her once, a direct measuring gaze that lasted perhaps 3 seconds, then dropped his eyes to the floor in a gesture that might have been respect or might have been shame. Ethan, Judge Blackwell said, his voice taking on a false joviality. This is Miss Evelyn Carter. I've told you about her. Sir? Ethan's voice was low, roughened by disuse or perhaps by the permanent inhalation of stable dust. Miss Carter is considering your proposal of marriage. Evelyn saw Ethan's shoulders stiffen, saw confusion flash across his face. Sir, I never— You told me you wanted a wife, the judge interrupted smoothly. Here's your opportunity. Miss Carter, this is the man who'll be your husband if you agree to my terms. He has a cabin 10 miles west of town, primitive, but shelter. He can provide for you. And he'll treat you with all the respect a wife deserves. Won't you, Ethan? Sir, I don't understand what's happening. Do you want a wife or not? The judge's voice had sharpened. Ethan's jaw worked, and for a moment Evelyn saw something flash in those winter sky eyes. Anger, perhaps, or recognition of the trap being laid. But when he spoke, his voice was carefully neutral. If the lady is willing, sir. She is, Judge Blackwell declared before Evelyn could speak. Aren't you, Miss Carter? After all, the alternative is so unpleasant. Evelyn wanted to scream, to rage, to burn the entire situation down around them all. But she looked at her father's defeated face, thought of her mother stranded and penniless, and felt the trap close around her like iron. I have conditions, she said. You're in no position to make conditions, the judge replied. Then you're in no position to claim this is anything but slavery. Evelyn's voice was ice. If I'm to agree to this farce, I'll do it on my terms. I want it in writing that my father's debt is forgiven in full, that the bank and the house are returned to him without encumbrance. And I want— She faltered, searching for something, anything, that would give her a shred of dignity in this nightmare. I want my personal belongings, my books,
This
my
story was
clothes,
posted on the channel
everything
west
that's
of
mine.
Betrayal. Please do
Judge
not
Blackwell
repost it
considered
in any
this.
form.
Agreed. On one condition of my own, you marry him today, this afternoon. No delays, no opportunities for cold feet. Today? William protested. Surely a few days to prepare. Today, the judge repeated. Or the original timeline stands. Choose quickly, Mr. Carter. It's nearly 11 o'clock. Evelyn felt the world narrowing to a single point, a single moment, a single choice that would define the rest of her life. She looked at Ethan Cole again, really looked at him, trying to see past the shock of the situation to the man beneath. He met her eyes this time, and she saw something there she hadn't expected. Understanding. As if he knew exactly how she felt. As if he, too, were being trapped. Miss Carter, he said quietly, and there was something in his voice, not quite apology, but a recognition of the absurdity, the cruelty of what was being done to both of them. If you agree to this, I give you my word I'll treat you with respect. I won't force anything. You'll be safe in my home. It was the kindness in his voice that broke something in her. Not because she wanted his kindness, but because it reminded her that this was happening. That in a matter of hours, she would be married to this stranger, exiled to a cabin in the wilderness, stripped of everything she'd been raised to expect from life. Do we have an agreement? Judge Blackwell pressed. Evelyn closed her eyes, took a breath, made her choice. Yes. The word felt like ashes in her mouth. What followed was a blur of motion and documentation. Papers were signed. Martha was sent to pack Evelyn's belongings. A minister was summoned, Reverend Clark, who looked deeply uncomfortable but didn't dare refuse the judge's request. William Carter sat in his study, staring at nothing, while the woman who'd been his daughter transformed into property to be transferred. Evelyn changed into a simple gray dress, not quite mourning, but close enough. She took off the jewelry her mother had given her over the years, each piece a memory of better times. They felt too precious to wear to her own execution. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, in the study where she'd learned to read as a child, Evelyn Carter married Ethan Cole. There were no guests beyond the legally required witnesses. No music. No flowers. Reverend Clark stumbled through the ceremony with obvious distress, his voice catching on words like love and cherish. Evelyn repeated her vows in a voice she didn't recognize as her own. Ethan's hand was steady when he slipped the plain iron band onto her finger. No gold, no gems, just a circle of metal that felt heavier than it should. I now pronounce you man and wife. The words hung in the air like a sentence. Judge Blackwell was the first to speak. Congratulations, Mrs. Cole. I'm sure you'll be very happy in your new life. His smile was pure malice wrapped in civility. Evelyn said nothing. There was nothing to say. Her father approached her as the judge and his men prepared to leave. Evelyn, Don't. She held up a hand to stop him. Don't apologize. Don't explain. Just don't. I'll make this right somehow. You can't. What's done is done. She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw a stranger. Goodbye, Father. You'll write? You'll visit? I don't know. And she didn't. She couldn't imagine a future beyond the next hour, the next minute. Everything beyond that was darkness. Martha had packed 3 trunks, an absurd amount of luggage for a frontier cabin, but Evelyn hadn't had the heart to tell her to pack less. The housemaid embraced her at the door, crying openly, "You'll be all right, miss. You're the strongest person I know." Evelyn wanted to tell her she was wrong, that she felt like glass about to shatter, but she just nodded and pulled away. Ethan had brought a wagon, rough-hewn but sturdy, pulled by 2 horses that looked better cared for than most people in Red Hollow. He loaded her trunks with an efficiency that spoke of long practice, securing them with rope that wouldn't come loose even on rough roads. "We should go before dark," he said quietly. "It's a 2-hour ride." Evelyn climbed onto the wagon seat without assistance, her movements mechanical. Ethan took up the reins beside her, maintaining a careful distance, as if afraid to touch her even accidentally. The town watched them leave. Evelyn could feel the eyes on her back, could imagine the whispers that would follow. The banker's daughter, married to a stable hand, how far she'd fallen, how the mighty had been brought low. Let them talk. Let them feast on her humiliation. She was beyond caring. The wagon rolled west, away from everything Evelyn had ever known. The last buildings of Red Hollow fell away, replaced by the endless expanse of frontier, brown grass, distant mountains, a sky so vast it felt like drowning. Neither of them spoke for the first hour. The only sounds were the creak of wagon wheels, the steady clip of hooves, the whisper of wind through dead grass. Finally, as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, Ethan broke the silence. "I didn't know," he said. "About the debt, the arrangement. Judge Blackwell called me in this morning, told me I'd be getting married this afternoon. I thought—" He trailed off. "You thought what?" Evelyn's voice was sharp. "I thought maybe you'd actually chosen this. Chosen me." He laughed, a bitter sound. "Stupid, I know. Women like you don't choose men like me." "Women like me," Evelyn repeated. "And what kind of woman am I?" "The kind who's been taught her whole life that she's better than everyone else, that her blood's somehow finer, her worth somehow greater." He glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "I'm not saying that to be cruel. It's just how it is. You were raised to think you were special, and maybe you were in that world. But out here," he gestured to the wilderness surrounding them. "Out here, nobody cares who your father was or what clothes you wear. The land doesn't give a damn about your pride." "Is this the part where you tell me I need to learn humility?" Evelyn's words were laced with venom. "Because I've already received that particular lesson today. Thank you." "No." Ethan's voice was quiet but firm. "This is the part where I tell you that I didn't want a wife who was forced on me any more than you wanted a husband you were sold to. But we're stuck with each other now. So we can spend our time making each other miserable, or we can try to find a way to live that doesn't feel like punishment." "And how do you propose we do that?" "I don't know yet," he admitted. "But I meant what I said earlier. You'll be safe. I won't force myself on you. You'll have your own space, your own bed. I'll treat you like a guest in my home if that's what you want." "A guest?" Evelyn let out a hollow laugh. "I'm your wife, not a guest. On paper, maybe. But in reality?" He shook his head. "We're strangers bound together by other people's decisions. That's all we are. At least for now." The honesty in his words caught her off guard. She'd expected resentment, or worse, some attempt to claim authority over her. Instead, he was offering her something that resembled respect. It made everything worse somehow. Cruelty she could have fought against. Kindness just made her feel more lost. The cabin appeared as the sun touched the horizon. A small structure of rough-hewn logs, smoke rising from a stone chimney, surrounded by nothing but grassland and sky. It looked impossibly lonely, impossibly far from everything that had defined Evelyn's life. "It's not much," Ethan said as he brought the wagon to a stop. "But it's solid. Keeps out the wind and the cold. There's a creek about 100 yards north, always runs clear, and—" He seemed to search for other selling points and came up empty. "It's home." Evelyn climbed down from the wagon, her legs stiff from the ride. She stood looking at the cabin, trying to reconcile this rough shelter with the word home. It seemed impossible that this was her life now, that she would sleep here, eat here, exist here, while the world she'd known continued without her. "I'll bring in your things," Ethan said. You can go inside if you want. Warm yourself by the fire." She watched him carry her trunks one by one, his movements efficient despite their weight. When he'd finished, he lingered by the door, seeming uncertain. "There's only one bed," he said finally. "I'll sleep by the fire tonight. Tomorrow I'll build another one, or a partition, or something. I hadn't planned on—" He stopped himself. "I'll figure it out." "Thank you," Evelyn heard herself say, the words automatic. "You don't have to thank me for treating you like a human being." There was no heat in his words, just a tired sadness. That should be a given, not a courtesy. He left then, closing the door behind him to give her privacy. Evelyn stood alone in the cabin that was now supposed to be her home, surrounded by her trunks full of silks and books, and all the trappings of a life that had ended this morning. She didn't cry. Crying would have implied that some part of her still believed this could be fixed, that tears might wash away what had happened. But she knew better. This was permanent, Irrevocable. Evelyn Carter, no, Evelyn Cole now, had fallen from the heights of Red Hollow society to a frontier cabin with a man she didn't know, bound by legal papers and her father's
This story was
desperation.
posted on the channel
Outside,
west
she
of
could hear
Betrayal.
Ethan seeing to
Please
the
do not
horses,
repost
the
it in
familiar
any
sounds
form.
of livestock being tended, routine noises, the kind of sounds that had always been background noise in her life, performed by people she'd barely noticed. Now those sounds were the rhythm of her days. She opened one of her trunks, pulling out the first book her hand touched. It was a volume of Emerson, essays on self-reliance and transcendence, purchased when she'd been young enough to believe such things mattered. The irony wasn't lost on her. As darkness settled over the frontier, Evelyn sat in a rough wooden chair by the fire, her expensive dress looking absurd in these surroundings, and tried to imagine what came next. Tomorrow she would wake up as someone new, someone she didn't recognize. The proud woman who'd rejected a judge's son was gone. In her place was this stranger, this wife to a stable hand, this exile from everything she'd been. The fire crackled, the wind whispered around the cabin walls, and Evelyn Cole began the long process of learning what it meant to survive when everything you'd built your identity upon had been stripped away. This was her fall. This was her punishment. This was her new life. And somewhere in the darkness, she would have to find a way to live it. The first night passed in a strange, hollow silence that felt more suffocating than any sound could have been. Evelyn lay in the bed that smelled of unfamiliar soap and wood smoke, staring at the rough-hewn ceiling beams barely visible in the dying firelight. She could hear Ethan's breathing from across the room where he'd made a pallet on the floor, steady and measured, the breathing of someone accustomed to sleeping lightly. Every creak of the cabin settling, every whisper of wind against the walls felt amplified in the darkness. She didn't sleep, couldn't sleep. Her mind kept circling back to the same impossible fact. This was real. This rough cabin, this stranger sleeping 10 feet away, this new name that felt foreign on her tongue, all of it was real and permanent and utterly inescapable. When gray dawn light finally seeped through the single window, Evelyn heard Ethan rise quietly. She kept her eyes closed, feigning sleep, listening as he moved about the cabin with practiced silence. The scrape of the fire poker, the soft click of the door latch, the sound of his boots on the hard-packed earth outside. Only when she was certain he'd gone did she open her eyes. The cabin looked even more primitive in daylight. One main room that served as kitchen, dining area, and living space. A stone fireplace that had clearly been built by someone who understood function over form. A table with two mismatched chairs, shelves holding basic supplies, flour, salt, coffee, dried beans. Everything necessary for survival, nothing superfluous. Her 3 trunks sat against the far wall like accusations, packed with silks and satins and leather-bound books that belonged to another life entirely. Evelyn forced herself to rise, to face the day. She found a basin of water on the table, Ethan must have filled it before he left, and washed her face with hands that still bore the softness of a life without manual labor. Her reflection in the small mirror above the basin showed a stranger with tangled hair and shadows under her eyes. She was attempting to arrange her hair into something respectable when the door opened and Ethan entered carrying a pail of fresh milk. "Morning," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "Didn't know if you'd be awake yet." "I've been awake for hours." The words came out sharper than she'd intended. He set the pail down without comment and moved to the fireplace, building up the fire with efficiency. "There's coffee if you want it. Pot's on the shelf there." Evelyn had never made coffee in her life. Martha had always brought it to her room each morning, perfectly prepared, the right temperature, the right strength. But she'd rather die than admit that to this man. She found the pot, found the coffee grounds, and attempted to replicate what she'd seen servants do 1,000 times. The result was a bitter, grounds-filled disaster that she forced herself to drink anyway, pride preventing her from asking for help. Ethan watched her struggle with it, said nothing, but she caught something that might have been amusement flash across his face before he looked away. "I need to ride out to the eastern pasture today," he said after a long silence. "Check the fence line before the weather turns. You'll be alone for most of the day." "I'm accustomed to being alone." Another lie. She'd never been truly alone in her life. There had always been servants, family, social obligations filling every hour. "There's food in the larder. Help yourself to whatever you want." He hesitated. "The door has a bar on the inside. If anyone comes by while I'm gone, you expect visitors? The thought sent a spike of anxiety through her. Not really. We're pretty isolated out here, but just in case, don't open the door unless you know who it is. Are you trying to frighten me? I'm trying to keep you safe. His winter sky eyes met hers directly. The frontier isn't kind to women alone. That's just reality, not a threat. He left shortly after, saddling a horse with movements that spoke of years of practice. Evelyn watched from the window as he rode east, his figure growing smaller against the endless expanse of brown grass until he disappeared entirely. Then she was truly alone. The silence pressed in from all sides. In Red Hollow, there had always been noise, carriages rattling past, neighbors calling to each other, the constant hum of a town conducting its business. Here, there was only the wind and the occasional cry of a hawk circling overhead. Evelyn spent the morning exploring her new prison. The cabin was smaller than her bedroom had been in the Carter house. The larder Ethan had mentioned held basic staples, but nothing fresh except the milk he'd brought in. There was a small garden plot behind the cabin, mostly dead now with the approach of winter, but she could see where someone had tended it carefully. Rows of withered bean plants, the brown stalks of what might have been tomatoes, a patch of herbs gone to seed. Behind the cabin stood a crude barn where Ethan kept his horses and a cow. The animals were well cared for, their stalls clean, fresh hay in the feeding racks. Whatever else Ethan Cole might be, he wasn't neglectful. By midday, Evelyn's restless exploration had exhausted the possibilities of her new home. She returned to the cabin and, for lack of anything better to do, opened one of her trunks. The sight of her belongings, carefully folded dresses, her mother's jewelry wrapped in velvet, books she'd collected over years, made her throat tight. Each item was a reminder of what she'd lost. That emerald silk dress she'd worn to the governor's ball, the sapphire earrings her father had given her for her 21st birthday, the complete works of Shakespeare, inscribed with her mother's handwriting. For Evelyn, who sees the world in words. She pulled out the Shakespeare, running her fingers over the worn leather binding. How many hours had she spent reading these plays, imagining herself as the clever heroines who outwitted their circumstances? How naive she'd been to think wit and words could protect her from the brutal realities of frontier justice. The sound of hoofbeats startled her from her thoughts. She moved to the window, heart pounding, but relaxed slightly when she saw it was Ethan returning. He was earlier than she'd expected, the sun still high overhead. He entered carrying something wrapped in cloth, his expression grim. "What's wrong?" The question escaped before she could stop it. "Fence is down in 3 places. Looks like someone cut it." He unwrapped the cloth, revealing several strands of barbed wire, cleanly severed. This wasn't weather damage. Who would do that? Could be anyone. There are people who don't take kindly to homesteaders claiming land they think should stay open range. Or, he stopped himself. Or what? Or it could be someone sending me a message. His jaw was tight. About yesterday. About you. The implication hit her like cold water. You think Judge Blackwell? I think the judge enjoys reminding people of their place. And right now, I've got something he gave me out of spite. Something he could take back just as easily if he wanted to make a point. I'm not a something, Evelyn said coldly. That's not what I meant. Ethan set the wire down with more force than necessary. But that's how he sees you, how he sees both of us. We're pieces on his board, and he moves us where he wants. Then what do? We fix the fence. We keep our heads down. We survive. He looked at her, and there was something bleak in his expression. That's all we can do out here, Mrs. Cole. Survive and hope we're not interesting enough to bother with anymore. The name, Mrs. Cole, sounded wrong in his mouth, foreign and formal, and utterly disconnected from who she was. Don't call me that, she said quietly. It's your name now. It's a name that was forced on me. Just like this cabin, just like this marriage. She wrapped her arms around herself. You don't have to pretend this is normal, that we're normal. I'm not pretending anything. Ethan's voice was tired. But whether we like it or not, that piece of paper we signed yesterday is legal. You're Mrs. Cole, and I'm stuck being the stable hand who somehow ended up married to the banker's daughter. We can fight against it all we want, but it won't change the facts. Then what do you suggest, that I just accept this? Smile and pretend I chose any of this? I suggest you decide whether you want to spend your energy being angry at a situation neither of us can change, or whether you want to
This
figure out
story
how
was
to actually
posted on the
live.
channel
He
west of
moved to the
Betrayal.
door. I
Please
need to
do
go
not
back out and
repost it
repair
in
that
any
fence
form.
before dark. There's stew in the pot if you're hungry. I'll be back by nightfall. He was gone before she could form a response. Evelyn stood alone in the cabin, her hands shaking with frustration and something that felt dangerously close to despair. He was right, and she hated him for it. Being angry wouldn't change anything, but accepting this life felt like surrendering the last piece of herself that mattered. The afternoon stretched long and empty. She tried to read but couldn't focus on the words. Tried to eat the stew Ethan had mentioned but found she had no appetite. Finally, driven by a restlessness she couldn't name, she began to unpack one of her trunks. It was a mistake. Each dress she pulled out was a ghost of her former life. The rose silk she'd worn to charity functions, the dove gray she'd chosen for her failed courtship with Thomas Blackwell, the midnight blue she'd been saving for a special occasion that would now never come. She was refolding the midnight blue when she heard voices outside. Male voices. Multiple men. Evelyn's blood went cold. She moved to the window, careful to stay out of sight, and saw 3 riders approaching the cabin. They weren't wearing the rough work clothes of homesteaders or the practical gear of ranchers. These men were dressed too well, their horses too fine. One of them she recognized, the scarred man who delivered Judge Blackwell's ultimatum. Her hands found the door bar, sliding it into place with a heavy thunk. Her heart hammered against her ribs as the riders drew closer. They stopped just outside the cabin. She heard the creak of saddle leather as one of them dismounted. "Mrs. Cole?" The scarred man's voice was mockingly polite. "We know you're in there. Just want to have a friendly conversation." Evelyn said nothing, pressing herself against the wall beside the window. "Judge Blackwell sent us to check on you. Make sure you're settling in all right, that your new husband is treating you proper." A pause. "We saw him ride out earlier. Figured this might be a good time to pay our respects." The implication in those words made her skin crawl. "My husband will be back soon," she called out, hating how her voice shook. "Oh, we're counting on it." The scarred man laughed. "See, thing is, the judge is a generous man. He gave your father his bank back, forgave all that debt. But generosity comes with expectations. And one of those expectations is that you remember your place. That you don't get any ideas about coming back to town, making trouble, telling stories about how you were wronged. I have no intention of returning to Red Hollow." "That's real good to hear, Mrs. Cole. Real good. Because if you did come back, if you did start talking about debts and forced marriages and such, well, the judge might have to reconsider his mercy. Might decide your father's bank isn't quite as sound as it seems. Might find all sorts of irregularities in the books." The threat was clear: stay quiet and exiled, or her father would pay the price. "I understand," Evelyn said, each word tasting like poison. "Excellent. One more thing, though." The scarred man's voice took on a harder edge. "That fence damage your husband found today? That was just a friendly reminder. The judge owns a lot of land around these parts. He doesn't take kindly to homesteaders who get too comfortable. So you tell your husband to be careful, to remember that everything he has, including you, exists because the judge allows it. Understand?" Before Evelyn could answer, she heard new hoofbeats approaching fast. Through the window, she saw Ethan riding hard toward the cabin, and even from a distance, she could see the rifle across his saddle. The scarred man remounted quickly. "Looks like your husband's back early. We'll be going now. But you remember what I said, Mrs. Cole. Remember where you belong." The 3 riders wheeled their horses and rode off, not hurrying, but not lingering either. Ethan pulled up in a cloud of dust, watching them go, his hand still on the rifle. When he finally dismounted and approached the cabin, Evelyn unbarred the door. What did they want? His voice was controlled, but she could see the tension in his shoulders. "To deliver a message. From the judge." She repeated the conversation, watching Ethan's expression grow darker with each word. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he set the rifle carefully against the wall and moved to the fireplace, his movements deliberate. "I'm sorry," he said finally. "For what? You didn't send them here. For bringing you into this. If I'd known—" He stopped himself. "But I should have known. Should have realized the judge wouldn't just hand you over and walk away. This is all part of it, keeping us isolated, keeping us afraid, making sure we understand that we exist at his sufferance. We could leave, Evelyn heard herself say. Just go somewhere else, somewhere beyond his reach. With what money? What prospects? Ethan shook his head. I've got this cabin and 40 acres, a few horses, a cow, enough supplies to last the winter if we're careful. That's it. That's everything I own in the world. If we left, we'd be destitute. And the judge's reach is longer than you think. Men like him have connections all across the territories. So we're trapped. We're trapped, he confirmed. Unless you want to risk your father losing everything again. Unless you want to gamble that the judge is bluffing about finding irregularities in the bank records. Evelyn sank into one of the chairs, the fight draining out of her. He's not bluffing. My father's business practices were never exactly ethical. If someone wanted to find violations, they could. Then we stay. We keep our heads down. We survive. There was that word again, survive. As if mere existence was supposed to be enough. As if living without purpose or hope or dignity was a victory. The evening passed in tense silence. Ethan made dinner, simple fare, beans and cornbread that he cooked with the competence of someone long accustomed to caring for himself. Evelyn ate without tasting, her mind circling the same impossible problem. She was bound to this place, to this man, to this life, not just by legal papers, but by threats against her family. There was no escape, no appeal, no rescue coming. As darkness fell, Ethan began arranging his pallet by the fire again. You don't have to sleep on the floor, Evelyn said, the word surprising her as much as him. He paused, looking at her warily. I told you I'd give you space. The bed is large enough for 2 people to sleep without touching, and the floor is cold. I may despise the circumstances that brought us here, but I'm not cruel enough to make you suffer needlessly for it. You sure? I'm sure I don't want to listen to you trying not to shiver all night. She stood, moving toward the bed. Just stay on your side. Yes, ma'am. That night they lay in the same bed, separated by a careful distance that felt like miles. Evelyn could feel the warmth radiating from Ethan's body, could hear his breathing gradually slow and deepen as he fell asleep. She remained awake long into the night, acutely aware of his presence, this stranger who was legally her husband, this man who showed her a kindness she didn't know how to accept. The days that followed established a pattern. Ethan rose before dawn to tend the animals and work the land. Evelyn woke to find coffee already made, properly made, not the disaster she'd produced that first morning, and some simple breakfast prepared. He would leave for the day, and she would be alone with her thoughts and her steadily growing restlessness. She tried to maintain some semblance of her former routines. She dressed carefully each morning, styled her hair as if she had somewhere to go. She read her books, trying to lose herself in worlds that felt increasingly irrelevant. But the silence and isolation wore at her like water on stone. On the 4th day, she made an attempt at cooking dinner. The results were catastrophic. Burned beans, cornbread that came out simultaneously raw in the middle and charred on the edges, coffee that even she couldn't choke down. Ethan took one look at the disaster and, to his credit, didn't laugh. You've never cooked before, he observed. I've never needed to. Evelyn stared at the ruined food with something close to despair. There were always servants. Well, there are no servants here, and if we're going to eat anything besides charcoal and disappointment, one of us is going to have to teach you. I'm not asking for your help. You're not asking. I'm offering. He moved to the fireplace, scraping out the ruined remains. Tomorrow morning, before I go out, I'll show you the basics. How to make coffee, how to cook beans without turning them into rocks, how to make bread that's actually edible. Why? The question burst out before she could stop it. Why are you being kind to me? I've done nothing but resent you since I got here. I've made it clear I despise this situation, that I see you as part of my punishment. So why do you keep helping? Ethan was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. Because being cruel would be easy. Because I could make your life miserable here, could claim the rights a husband has, could force you to submit in a dozen different ways. And maybe part of me even wants to, because you're right. You have made it clear you think you're better than me, that marrying me was a punishment worse than poverty. He looked at her then, and there was pain in his winter sky eyes. But I won't do that. Because I know what it's like to be powerless, to be at someone else's mercy. And I won't become the kind of man who
This
uses
story
power to
was
hurt
posted
people
on the
just because
channel
he
west
can.
of betrayal.
The honesty
Please
in
do
his
not
words left
repost
her
it in any
speechless.
form.
So yes, he continued, I'll teach you to cook. I'll make sure you're safe. I'll treat you with respect even when you show me none in return. Not because I'm a saint, but because I refuse to let this situation turn me into the kind of man Judge Blackwell probably expects me to be. That night, lying in the careful darkness with Ethan breathing steadily on the far side of the bed, Evelyn found herself thinking about his words, about cruelty and kindness, about power and choice, about what it meant to be a good person when circumstance had stripped away all the easy options. She had been so focused on her own humiliation, her own loss, that she hadn't considered what this situation might be like for Ethan. He hadn't chosen this either. He'd been used as a tool in Judge Blackwell's revenge, his life disrupted, his simple desire for a wife twisted into something ugly and coerced. And yet he'd chosen kindness, chosen to treat her with dignity when he could have demanded submission, chosen to help her learn skills she'd need to survive when he could have let her flounder and fail. It didn't erase her anger at the situation, didn't make her any less trapped, but it did make her wonder if perhaps her resentment had been aimed at the wrong target. True to his word, Ethan spent the next morning teaching her the basics of frontier cooking. He was patient with her failures, showing her again and again how to gauge the heat of the fire, how to judge when water was truly boiling, how to knead dough without overworking it. It's not about perfection, he said as she struggled with her third attempt at bread. It's about learning what works. Every fire is different. Every batch of flour behaves a little differently. You adjust and adapt. In Red Hollow, consistency was everything, Evelyn said, punching down the dough with more force than necessary. The same tea served at the same temperature at the same time every day. Precision was refinement. Out here, precision will drive you crazy. The frontier doesn't do precision. It does survival. He watched her work for a moment. That's actually not bad. The dough, I mean. You're getting the feel for it. The small praise shouldn't have meant anything, but Evelyn found herself standing a little straighter, putting more care into shaping the loaves. Over the following days, her skills slowly improved. The coffee became drinkable. The beans stopped resembling rocks. The bread, while never as perfect as what Martha had baked, became something they could actually eat without grimacing. And as she learned, something strange began to happen. The restless anxiety that had plagued her started to ease. There was something almost meditative about the simple tasks, the rhythmic kneading of bread, the careful tending of the fire, the precise measuring of coffee grounds. These were concrete problems with concrete solutions, unlike the impossible tangle of her larger situation. She also began to notice things about Ethan, the way he always left the easiest chores for when he knew she might want to help, how he never criticized her failures, only offered gentle corrections. The fact that he'd been carefully rationing the coffee and flour, making their supplies stretch, without ever mentioning it to her. One evening, about 2 weeks into her exile, she found him sitting at the table after dinner, staring at a piece of paper with an expression of intense concentration. "What is that?" she asked. He looked up, almost guiltily. "Letter from the land office, about my claim on this property." He set it down with a sigh. "I can make out some of the words, but not all of them. I'll have to ride into town tomorrow, find someone who can read it to me." Evelyn moved closer, looking at the letter. It was official correspondence, full of legal language, but straightforward enough. "It says your claim has been approved," she said slowly. "You now legally own this 40 acres, provided you maintain continuous residence and make improvements to the land." Ethan's face transformed, hope lighting his features. "Truly? It's approved?" "Truly." She read through the rest of it. "You'll need to submit an annual report of improvements, building additional structures, clearing land, that sort of thing. But yes, this land is yours." He let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for months. "I've been waiting for that approval since last spring. Started to think it would never come." "Why didn't you ask me to read it sooner?" "Didn't want to bother you. Figured you had enough to deal with without me asking favors." Evelyn looked at him, really looked at him, and saw a man who'd been fighting his own battles in silence, who'd been building a life out here in the wilderness, claim by careful claim, only to have a wife forced on him and threats delivered to his door. "You're not bothering me," she said quietly. "If you have other letters, other things you need read, I can help. You don't have to cheat. I know I don't have to. I'm offering." She met his eyes. "You've been teaching me to survive out here. Let me teach you something in return." Something shifted in his expression. "You'd do that?" "Yes." And as she said it, Evelyn realized she meant it. Not because she owed him, but because for the first time since her wedding day, she'd found something she could actually do. A way to be useful, to have purpose beyond simply existing. "I'd like that," Ethan said. "I've been wanting to learn to read properly for years now. Taught myself enough to get by, but it's slow going on my own." "Then we'll start tomorrow. After the chores are done, before dinner, an hour each day." "An hour each day," he repeated, and there was something like wonder in his voice. That night, as they lay in the darkness with the wind whistling around the cabin walls, Evelyn felt something she hadn't experienced since leaving Red Hollow, a sense of possibility. She was still trapped, still exiled, still married to a man she barely knew in a life she hadn't chosen. But for the first time, she wasn't just surviving. She was acting, making choices, however small. Finding ways to be more than just a victim of circumstance. It wasn't forgiveness, wasn't acceptance, but it was something, a crack in the wall of her resentment, letting in the faintest sliver of light. The frontier remained harsh and unforgiving. Judge Blackwell's threats still hung over them like storm clouds. Winter was coming, bringing challenges she couldn't yet imagine. But in a rough cabin on 40 acres of hard-won land, two people who'd been forced together by cruelty were beginning to find their own way forward. Not as husband and wife, not yet, perhaps not ever in the traditional sense, but as allies, as partners in survival, as two people learning, day by day, that kindness in the face of hardship might be the most radical choice of all. The lessons began the next evening, after the dishes had been cleared and the fire built up against the November cold that was starting to bite with real teeth. Evelyn retrieved one of her simpler books from the trunk, a collection of frontier tales she'd once dismissed as pedestrian, and set it on the table between them. Ethan approached it the way another man might approach a rattlesnake, cautious and uncertain. "I should tell you," he said, settling into the chair across from her. "I'm not starting from nothing. I can read some. Taught myself enough to get by with signs, simple letters, that sort of thing. But anything more complicated than a few sentences, and I'm lost." "Show me." Evelyn opened the book to a random page and slid it toward him. Ethan leaned over the text, his brow furrowing in concentration. His finger traced under the words as he read haltingly. "The trapper moved quietly through this. He stopped, frustration evident in the set of his jaw. "That word. I don't know it." "Underbrush," Evelyn supplied. "The small plants and shrubs that grow beneath the trees." "Underbrush," he repeated, committing it to memory. "That makes sense in context." The trapper moved quietly through the underbrush. He continued reading, stumbling over words like cautiously and descended, but managing more than Evelyn had expected. When he finished the paragraph, he looked up at her almost defensively. "I know it's not good." "It's better than not reading at all," she said, and meant it. "You've taught yourself the basics, which is more than most people manage without help. We just need to build on what you already know." Over the next hour, they worked through pronunciation, sounding out unfamiliar words, discussing context and meaning. Ethan was a quick study when given proper instruction, his mind sharp despite the lack of formal education. He asked questions that showed genuine curiosity, not just rote memorization. "Why is night spelled with a K if you don't say it?" he demanded at one point, staring at the word with betrayed confusion. "Because English is a language that borrowed from everyone it conquered and never bothered to make sense of itself," Evelyn replied, surprising herself with the amusement in her voice. "You'll find it's full of rules that exist only to be broken." "That seems purposefully difficult." "Welcome to literacy." By the time they finished, the fire had burned low and Ethan's eyes were tired from the strain of focus. But there was something else in his expression too, satisfaction perhaps, or the beginning of pride. "Same time tomorrow?" he asked, closing the book with a care that suggested it was precious. "Same time tomorrow," Evelyn confirmed. The routine established itself quickly. Mornings were for survival, cooking, cleaning, tending to the practical necessities of frontier life. Days were for work, Ethan in the fields or repairing fences, Evelyn gradually taking on more of the household tasks as her skills improved. Evenings were for learning, an hour carved out of the darkness where master and
This story
student
was
traded
posted
places
on the
depending
channel
on the
West
subject.
of Betrayal.
Evelyn
Please do
taught
not
Ethan to
repost
read
it
with
in any
increasing
form.
fluency, introducing him to more complex texts as his confidence grew. In return, he taught her the skills she'd never needed in Red Hollow: how to chop wood without injuring herself, how to recognize the signs of changing weather, how to handle a rifle well enough to defend herself if the need arose. "The key is not to fight the recoil," he explained one crisp afternoon, standing behind her as she aimed at a target he'd set up. "Let the rifle do what it's going to do. Just keep your grip firm and your eye on what you're shooting at." She pulled the trigger. The crack of the shot echoed across the empty land, and the bottle Ethan had placed on a fence post exploded in a satisfying spray of glass. "Like that?" she asked, lowering the rifle. "Exactly like that." There was approval in his voice. "You're a natural." Or, "I'm just very motivated to be able to protect myself." That too. As the days shortened and the cold deepened, Evelyn found herself noticing things about Ethan that she'd been too angry to see before. The way he always made sure she had the warmest blanket at night, how he'd repaired the roof where it leaked, prioritizing her comfort over his own tasks. The quiet competence with which he approached every challenge, never complaining, never demanding recognition for his efforts. She also noticed the way he changed during their reading lessons. The rough frontier man gave way to someone eager and engaged, his eyes lighting up when he mastered a new word or concept. He consumed books the way a starving man consumed bread, staying up late into the night by firelight, determined to finish each story once he'd started. "You love this," she observed one evening, watching him struggle through a particularly complex passage. "Learning to read, I mean. It's not just practical for you." Ethan looked up from the page, and for a moment she saw past all his careful defenses to something vulnerable beneath. "When I was a boy, maybe 7 or 8, there was a school teacher who came through our town. She had this book of adventure stories, and she'd read to anyone who'd listen. I used to sit outside the schoolhouse window just to hear her voice, to imagine the places she was describing." He ran his hand over the page in front of him. "I promised myself that someday I'd be able to read those stories myself. That I wouldn't need someone else to open that world for me." "What happened? Why didn't you go to school?" "My father needed me working. We were poor, really poor, not the polite kind where you still have a roof and food. I was out in the fields or helping with whatever work he could find from sunrise to sunset. And then..." He stopped, something dark crossing his face. "Then other things happened, and school stopped being a possibility." Evelyn wanted to ask what those other things were, but something in Ethan's expression warned her off. Instead, she said quietly, "Well, you're learning now. Better late than never." "Thanks to you." He met her eyes, and there was gratitude there that made her uncomfortable. "I know you didn't choose to be here, didn't choose any of this, but I'm grateful for the lessons, for the chance to finally keep that promise I made to myself." The words created a strange tightness in her chest. She'd been so focused on what had been taken from her that she hadn't considered what she might be giving in return. These lessons weren't just passing time, they were changing Ethan's life in fundamental ways, opening doors that had been closed to him since childhood. "You're welcome," she said, and found that she meant it. December arrived with a vengeance, bringing snow that transformed the brown landscape into something almost beautiful. The wind howled around the cabin with increasing ferocity, and the temperature dropped low enough that ice formed on the inside of the windows each night. Evelyn woke one morning to find Ethan already up, feeding extra wood into the fireplace. "Storm coming?" he said without preamble. "A bad one, from the look of those clouds. We need to bring in extra firewood, make sure the animals are secure, fill every container we have with water before the creek freezes solid." They worked through the morning with focused urgency, Evelyn following Ethan's instructions without question. She hauled wood until her arms ached, her expensive dresses long since abandoned in favor of the practical wool clothing Ethan had scrounged from somewhere. She helped him secure the barn doors and move the animals to the most sheltered areas. By noon, the first flakes were falling. By mid-afternoon, the world had disappeared behind a wall of white. They huddled in the cabin as the storm raged outside, the wind so loud it sounded like something alive and angry trying to break through the walls. Snow piled against the door, blocking out what little light filtered through the windows. The temperature inside the cabin dropped despite the roaring fire, their breath misting in the air. "How long will this last?" Evelyn asked, pulling her blanket tighter around her shoulders. "Could be a day. Could be 3. Ethan was checking their supplies, taking mental inventory. "We've got enough food and firewood if we're careful. The animals should be fine in the barn. I lined it properly before winter set in. And if we're not careful, then we'll be hungry and cold before it's over." He said it matter-of-factly, without drama. "But we'll make it. I've weathered worse storms than this." As darkness fell early that afternoon, they found themselves trapped in the small circle of firelight, the storm creating a strange intimacy. There was nowhere to go, nothing to do but sit and wait and try to stay warm. Ethan pulled out the book they'd been reading, a collection of essays by Emerson that had challenged him more than the adventure stories. "Might as well use the time for a lesson," he said. "In this light, you'll strain your eyes. Then you read to me, like that schoolteacher used to." He handed her the book with a slight smile. "Consider it payment for all those cooking lessons." Evelyn accepted the book and began to read, her voice filling the cabin as the storm screamed outside. She read about self-reliance and the individual soul, about finding truth in nature and wisdom in solitude. The words took on new meaning here in this isolated cabin with the wilderness pressing in on all sides. Ethan listened with complete attention, his eyes fixed on her face in the firelight. When she finished a particularly complex passage about conformity and society, he interrupted. "Do you agree with that? What he's saying about how society tries to make everyone the same?" "I never thought about it much before," Evelyn admitted. "When I read this in Red Hollow, it seemed like romantic philosophy. Interesting but not particularly relevant. And now? Now I think maybe Emerson understood something I didn't, that there's a cost to fitting into society's expectations. That sometimes the price of belonging is giving up pieces of yourself until there's nothing genuine left." She closed the book, looking at the fire. "I spent my whole life trying to be what Red Hollow expected. The perfect daughter, the perfect lady, always appropriate, always refined. And in the end, those same people who demanded I conform were the ones who cast me out the moment I stopped being useful to them. That's the part I never understood about town folks," Ethan said quietly. "All those rules about proper behavior, proper dress, proper everything. But underneath it all, you're just as cruel as anyone else. Maybe crueler because you dress it up in pretty words and call it civilization." "We weren't all cruel." "No," he agreed, "but the ones who mattered were. The ones with power." He poked at the fire, sending sparks spiraling up the chimney. "At least out here, there's no pretense. If a man's going to do you harm, he doesn't smile and shake your hand first. He just does it." "Is that better?" "It's honest." He looked at her then, his winter sky eyes reflecting the firelight. "I'd rather face an honest enemy than a false friend any day." The storm continued through the night and into the next day. They took turns feeding the fire, rationing their food, finding ways to pass the time. Evelyn read until her voice grew hoarse. Ethan told stories of his years working ranches and stables, of the places he'd been and the people he'd known. They played simple card games with a worn deck Ethan kept in a drawer. They talked about things that didn't matter, and things that did, the enforced proximity stripping away some of the careful distance they'd maintained. On the second night of the storm, as they lay in bed with the wind still howling and the temperature dropping even further, Evelyn found herself shivering uncontrollably despite the blankets. "You're freezing," Ethan observed, his voice cutting through the darkness. "I'm fine." "You're not fine. You're shaking so hard I can feel it from here." He hesitated, then said carefully, "We could share body heat. It's the practical thing to do in weather like this." "But that's not... We can't..." "I'm not suggesting anything inappropriate," he interrupted, his voice firm. "I'm suggesting that we both might survive the night more comfortably if we stopped being stupid about maintaining propriety when our lives could be at stake. But it's your choice. I won't move unless you say so." Evelyn lay there shivering, pride warring with practicality. The truth was she was colder than she'd ever been in her life, cold enough that her fingers had gone numb, and her teeth were chattering. And Ethan was right. Out here, propriety was a luxury they couldn't afford. "All right," she said finally, hating how small her voice sounded. She felt the bed shift as Ethan moved closer, then the warmth of his body as he arranged the blankets around them both. He was careful to keep his hands to himself, his presence warm but not invasive. Within minutes, Evelyn could feel the cold receding, replaced by a warmth
This story
that made
was
her
posted
entire
on the
body
channel
relax.
West of Betrayal.
"Thank you."
Please
she
do not
whispered.
repost it
"Just
in any
staying alive,"
form.
he replied. But there was something gentle in his voice, an understanding that this was difficult for her, that he respected her discomfort even as he addressed the practical necessity. She fell asleep that night warmer than she'd been in weeks. And if she dreamed of Red Hollow and the life she'd lost, the dreams were less bitter than before. By the third day, the storm finally broke. They emerged from the cabin to find the world transformed. Snow piled as high as Ethan's waist in places, the barn barely visible through the drifts. It took them hours to dig out enough to reach the animals, who had survived but were understandably unhappy about their prolonged confinement. Working together in the brutal cold, they cleared paths, broke ice, hauled fresh hay. It was exhausting work, and by the time they returned to the cabin that evening, Evelyn could barely move her frozen fingers. "Here," Ethan said, taking her hands in his and rubbing them gently to restore circulation. "You need to be more careful. Frostbite's no joke." "I didn't realize how cold I'd gotten," she admitted, watching as he worked warmth back into her hands with practiced efficiency. "That's how it gets you. You stop feeling it, stop paying attention, and suddenly you've lost a finger or two." He held her hands until the color returned, until she could flex her fingers without pain. "Better?" "Better." She looked at their joined hands, struck by how natural it felt. When had that happened? When had his touch stopped feeling foreign? That night they resumed their reading lessons, but something had shifted. The storm had stripped away another layer of their careful politeness, leaving something more honest in its place. They sat closer now, heads bent together over the book, Ethan's shoulder touching hers as he pointed to words he didn't recognize. "This passage," he said, struggling through a section about society and the individual. "He's saying that people are afraid to stand alone, that they'd rather belong to something, even something wrong, than risk being cast out. That's part of it, yes. Like you were. Cast out, I mean. Because you stood alone. Because you wouldn't marry Thomas Blackwell just to keep your place in society." Evelyn considered this, surprised by the insight. "I suppose that's true, though I didn't think of it as standing alone at the time. I thought of it as just refusing to be sold." "It's the same thing, isn't it? You chose yourself over what everyone expected of you, even knowing the cost." "I chose wrong, apparently. Look where it got me." "You're alive," Ethan said simply. "You're learning to survive. You're building something new, even if it's not what you wanted. That's not nothing. It's not what I had either. What you had was built on lies and cruelty. Your father's business, the town's respect, all of it was fragile. It was always going to collapse eventually. You just happened to be the excuse when it did." He turned to look at her directly. "At least out here, what we're building is real. Difficult, yes, not what either of us chose, but real." The words hit her harder than they should have, cutting through her remaining bitterness to something raw and true beneath. He was right. Everything she'd lost had been an illusion, a pretty facade covering rot. This cabin, this life, this strange partnership they were forging, it might not be pretty, but it was solid, real. "When did you become so wise?" she asked, trying to lighten the moment. "I'm not wise. I just read a lot now." His smile took the edge off the self-deprecation. "You're a good teacher. And you're a good student." They held each other's gaze for a moment longer than necessary, something unspoken passing between them. Then Ethan cleared his throat and returned his attention to the book, and the moment passed. But it had happened. That brief connection, that recognition of something shifting between them. Evelyn couldn't name it, wasn't ready to examine it too closely, but she felt it nonetheless. A warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. The days after the storm fell into a new rhythm. The reading lessons continued, but they expanded beyond simple literacy. Ethan wanted to understand everything: history, philosophy, even poetry, though he claimed it made his head hurt. Evelyn found herself engaged in discussions she'd never had in Red Hollow, where conversation had been about propriety and gossip, never ideas. But why does the poet compare love to a summer's day? Ethan demanded one evening, staring at a Shakespeare sonnet with betrayed frustration. That makes no sense. Summer's hot and uncomfortable and full of flies. It's a metaphor, Evelyn explained, fighting back a smile. He's saying the person he loves is as beautiful and precious as summer. Summer's not precious. It's sweaty. You're being deliberately obtuse. I'm being honest. If I wanted to tell someone they were beautiful, I'd just say it straight. You're beautiful. Simple, clear, no flies involved. Poetry isn't about being simple. Poetry is about making things complicated for no good reason, Ethan countered. But there was humor in his eyes, and Evelyn realized he was arguing just to see her defend the position, testing her or perhaps enjoying the debate. You're impossible, she said, but without heat. And you love teaching me anyway. The words hung in the air for a moment. Love was too strong, too complicated a word for what was happening between them. But Evelyn couldn't deny that she did find satisfaction in these lessons, in watching Ethan's mind open and expand, and seeing him discover worlds he'd been denied. I enjoy it, she conceded carefully. Is that acceptable? More than acceptable. Ethan's voice had gone soft. More than I probably deserve. Well, why would you say that? Because I'm the stable hand who ended up with the banker's daughter. Everyone in Red Hollow thinks I got something I didn't earn, that I'm not worthy of you, and they're probably right. They're absolutely wrong. The words came out fierce, surprising them both. Those people forced us together as punishment, and now they want to judge you for the situation they created. That's their hypocrisy, not your unworthiness. You believe that? I'm starting to. Evelyn realized it was true. Her anger at the situation hadn't disappeared, but it had shifted. She wasn't angry at Ethan for being forced into marriage with her. She was angry at Judge Blackwell for using them both as pawns, at her father for his weakness, at a system that treated people as property to be bartered and traded. But not at Ethan. Not anymore. Winter deepened, bringing challenges that tested them in new ways. A tree fell during another storm, damaging part of the barn roof. They repaired it together, Evelyn holding boards in place while Ethan hammered, both of them working until their hands were raw and their breath came in ragged gasps from the cold. The cow fell ill, and Evelyn found herself helping Ethan nurse it through fevered nights, learning which herbs to brew, how to recognize signs of improvement or decline. When the animal finally recovered, she felt a pride in the achievement that was entirely new to her. These were small victories, practical and unglamorous. But they were victories nonetheless, earned through effort and cooperation, building something that felt increasingly like partnership. One evening in late December, as snow fell softly outside and the cabin glowed with firelight, Ethan set down the book he'd been reading and looked at Evelyn with an expression she couldn't quite read. "What is it?" she asked. "I just realized something. I've been thinking of you as the banker's daughter this whole time, or as Evelyn Carter, the woman I was forced to marry. But you're not her anymore, are you? You're someone different now." "I'm the same person." "No." He shook his head. "That woman couldn't cook, couldn't chop wood, couldn't nurse a sick cow back to health. That woman wouldn't have survived 2 weeks out here, much less 2 months. You're Evelyn Cole now. Someone new, someone stronger." The name still felt strange, but less foreign than it had. Evelyn Cole. A woman who could survive the frontier, who could teach a stable hand to read and learn from him in turn, who could face hardship without breaking. Maybe Ethan was right. Maybe she wasn't the same person who'd left Red Hollow in shame and bitterness. Maybe that fall had broken something old and allowed something new to grow in its place. "If I'm Evelyn Cole," she said slowly, "then who are you?" "What do you mean?" "You're not just the stable hand anymore either. You own land now. You're learning to read, to write, to engage with ideas. You're becoming someone different too." Ethan considered this, his winter sky eyes thoughtful in the firelight. "I suppose I am, though I'm not sure who yet. Still figuring that part out." "We both are," Evelyn said. And then, before she could second-guess herself, she added, "But maybe that's all right. Maybe we're allowed to figure it out together." The smile that spread across Ethan's face was the most genuine she'd seen from him, transforming his features from guarded to open, from careful to hopeful. "Together," he repeated, testing the word. I like the sound of that. That night, they fell asleep as they had every night since the storm, sharing warmth, maintaining propriety, but no longer pretending they were strangers bound by force alone. They were
This
partners
story was
now,
posted on the
allies in
channel
a shared
west of
journey toward
Betrayal.
something neither
Please
of
do
them
not
could yet
repost
name,
it in any
but
form.
both were beginning to believe in. The transformation wasn't complete. The wounds of their forced marriage hadn't fully healed, but they were healing slowly through kindness and patience and the daily choice to treat each other with dignity, despite the indignity of their circumstances. Outside, winter reigned supreme, cold and merciless and unforgiving. But inside the cabin, something warm and fragile and increasingly precious was taking root, growing stronger with each passing day, each shared lesson, each small victory won together against the harsh demands of frontier life. January arrived with the cold so brutal it felt like the land itself was trying to kill them. The morning Evelyn woke to find ice crusted on the inside of the windows, thick enough to obscure the pale sunrise. She understood for the first time what Ethan had meant about the frontier not caring about your pride or your past. The cold was absolute, indifferent, a physical force that would take your life as casually as you might swat a fly. She'd learned to build up the fire before bed, but even so, her breath misted in the frigid air as she wrapped herself in every blanket within reach and stumbled toward the fireplace. Ethan was already there, coaxing reluctant flames from the embers, his hands moving with the careful precision of someone who'd done this 1,000 times before. "Don't go outside today unless you absolutely have to," he said without turning around. "I checked the temperature just before dawn, cold enough to freeze exposed skin in minutes. The animals? I'll handle them. You stay inside where it's warm." He finally looked at her and his expression was serious. "I mean it, Evelyn. This isn't the kind of cold you're used to. This is the kind that kills people." She wanted to argue, to insist she could help, but the memory of her frostbitten fingers from the December storm stopped her. "Be careful." "Always am." He pulled on layers of clothing until he looked twice his normal size, wrapped a scarf around his face until only his eyes were visible, and headed for the door. "If I'm not back in 2 hours, don't come looking for me. Just keep the fire going and wait." The words sent a spike of fear through her chest. "That's not reassuring." "It's realistic. 2 hours means something went wrong. 3 hours means I'm probably dead. 4 hours means you need to start thinking about survival without me." He said it matter-of-factly, without drama, but the implications hung heavy in the air. "Ethan, I'll be fine. I've done this before." He paused at the door, his hand on the latch. "But if something does happen, there's money hidden in the floorboard under the bed. Enough to get you to the next town. Maybe find work somewhere. Don't try to stay here alone. Promise me." "I promise," she said, though the words felt like ash in her mouth. He nodded and disappeared into the brutal cold. The next 2 hours were the longest of Evelyn's life. She kept the fire burning, made coffee that went cold while she stared at the door, tried to read, but couldn't focus on the words. Every sound made her jump. Was that the door opening? Was that Ethan returning? When he finally came back, snow crusted on every surface of his clothing and ice hanging from his eyebrows, she felt such relief it made her knees weak. "The animals?" she asked as he stripped off the frozen layers. "Cold but alive. Fed and watered, should be good until tomorrow morning." His teeth were chattering despite the warmth of the cabin. "There's a storm coming, bigger than the last one. We need to be ready." They spent the rest of the day preparing, a now familiar routine made urgent by the dropping temperature and darkening sky. Extra firewood stacked inside.
This
Every
story was
container
posted
filled
on the
with
channel
water,
west
food
of
supplies
Betrayal.
checked and rechecked.
Please do not
By nightfall,
repost it
they'd
in
done
any
everything
form.
humanly possible to prepare, and all that remained was to wait. The storm hit just after dark with a violence that made the December blizzard seem gentle by comparison. Wind hammered the cabin walls with such force that Evelyn feared the whole structure might collapse. Snow didn't fall so much as attack, driven horizontal by winds that howled like living things in pain. They huddled close to the fire, wrapped in every blanket they owned, and still the cold seeped in through invisible cracks. "Tell me something," Evelyn said, partly to distract herself from the storm's fury, partly because she genuinely wanted to know. "About before. About how you ended up here, living alone on the frontier." Ethan was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost lost beneath the wind. I told you my father needed me working instead of in school. What I didn't tell you was why. He wasn't a bad man, just a desperate one. We had a small farm back east, Pennsylvania. Barely enough to feed us, never enough to get ahead. When I was 12, there was a drought, lost everything. The bank took the farm and we ended up wandering, taking whatever work we could find. That must have been hard. Hard doesn't begin to cover it. My mother died the first winter, just gave up, stopped eating, stopped fighting. My father tried to hold things together, but he was broken after that. Started drinking, started making bad decisions. Ethan stared into the fire, his eyes distant with memory. When I was 15, he signed a contract with a logging company. Bound labor. We'd work off a debt he owed, supposedly earn wages on top of it. Except the debt never got smaller no matter how hard we worked, and the wages never materialized. That's slavery by another name. That's what it was. We were trapped. If we tried to leave, they'd have us arrested for breach of contract. If we complained, they made our lives hell. I watched men die in those camps. Accidents, they called them, though everyone knew better. My father lasted 2 years before a tree fell wrong and crushed him. His voice had gone flat, emotionless, in that way people develop when the emotions are too large to safely feel. I was 17, alone, still bound to that contract. How did you escape? Didn't escape. Survived. When I turned 18, the contract expired and they couldn't legally hold me anymore. I walked away with nothing but the clothes on my back and a hatred for anyone who uses power to trap people weaker than themselves. He looked at her then, and there was pain in his winter sky eyes. That's why I couldn't do it to you. Couldn't use my position as your husband to force anything, because I know what it's like to be trapped, to have no choices, to be someone's property in all but name. Evelyn felt something crack open in her chest, a wall she'd been carefully maintaining crumbling under the weight of his honesty. All this time she'd been so focused on her own loss, her own humiliation, that she hadn't truly considered what kind of man Ethan was, or why he'd treated her with such careful respect. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, "for what happened to you, and for not seeing you clearly before now. I was so angry about my situation that I never stopped to think about yours. You had every right to be angry. Maybe, but I didn't have the right to treat you like you were part of my punishment instead of another victim of the same cruelty." She moved closer to him, their shoulders touching. "Thank you. For being kind when you could have been cruel. For treating me like a person when the law gave you the right to treat me like property." "You are a person," Ethan said simply. "That shouldn't require thanks. It should be a given." They sat in silence for a while. The storm raging outside while inside, something fundamental continued to shift between them. The careful distance they'd maintained, the polite boundaries, the pretense that they were merely roommates sharing space, all of it was wearing away, revealing something more complex and real beneath. "Can I ask you something?" Ethan said eventually. "About Red Hollow. About your life before." "Ask. Were you happy before everything fell apart, I mean? When you were the banker's daughter with all the parties and pretty dresses and people treating you like you mattered, were you actually happy?" Evelyn considered the question, really considered it, instead of just responding with reflexive nostalgia. "I thought I was, but looking back now, I think I was just comfortable. I had a role to play, and I played it well. I knew the rules, knew how to navigate society, knew my place. There was security in that, certainty. But happiness?" She shook her head slowly. "I don't know that I ever stopped to ask if I was happy. It didn't seem like a relevant question. And now? Now I don't have the luxury of not asking. Every day out here is a choice, to keep going or to give up, to be miserable or to find some measure of contentment in small things." She looked at him. "I'm not going to pretend I'm happier now than I was then. This life is harder in every measurable way, but I think I'm more honest, more myself, whoever that is. Does that make sense?" Perfect sense. Ethan's hand found hers under the blankets, a gesture that had become familiar during the cold nights. "For what it's worth, I prefer this version of you. The one who can chop wood and argue about poetry and isn't afraid to tell me when I'm being stupid. I was never afraid to tell people when they were being stupid. True, But in Red Hollow, you had to dress it up in polite language. Out here, you can just say
This
it
story
straight.
was posted on the
You're
channel
being
west
stupid
of
right
Betrayal.
now, Evelyn said.
Please do not
but she was
repost
smiling.
it in any
See?
form.
Much better. The storm continued for 3 days, trapping them in the cabin with nothing but each other for company. They read through most of Evelyn's remaining books, argued about philosophy and politics, and whether Shakespeare was a genius or just pretentious, played cards until they'd memorized each other's tells, and talked about everything and nothing in the way people do when there's no escape and no pretense left to hide behind. On the second night, Evelyn woke to find Ethan at the table instead of in bed, writing something by candlelight with painful concentration. "What are you doing?" she asked, pulling a blanket around her shoulders against the cold. He looked up, almost guilty. "Practicing. I've been reading all these books, all these beautiful words, and I thought, I wanted to try writing something of my own, but it's harder than it looks. Can I see?" He hesitated, then slid the paper toward her. The handwriting was rough, letters uneven, but readable. What he'd written made her throat tight. "The frontier teaches you what you're made of. It strips away everything soft and comfortable until all that's left is what's real. I thought I knew myself before, just another laborer, nothing special, nothing worth noticing. But out here, I've learned I can be more. I can read words that smarter men wrote and understand them. I can teach myself new things. I can be kind when it would be easier to be cruel. And maybe, if I'm lucky, I can be worthy of the woman who's teaching me that change is possible even when everything else seems fixed and hopeless." Evelyn read it twice, then looked up to find Ethan watching her nervously. "It's rough," he said before she could speak. "I know the grammar's probably wrong, and it's not as fancy as the stuff we've been reading, but it's perfect," she interrupted, her voice thick with emotion. "It's honest and true and perfect exactly as it is." "You mean that?" "I do." She set the paper down carefully. "You're not just learning to read, Ethan. You're learning to express yourself, to capture your thoughts in words. That's remarkable." He ducked his head, almost shy. "Had a good teacher." "You had the desire to learn. That's more important than any teacher." That night, they fell asleep with the paper still on the table, Ethan's first attempt at writing preserved like something precious. And perhaps it was. Evidence of transformation, of a man becoming something more than he'd been allowed to be. When the storm finally broke on the 4th day, they emerged to find the world remade. Snow had drifted so high against the cabin's north wall that it nearly reached the roof. The barn was almost completely buried, only the peak of its roof visible. It took them 2 full days of backbreaking work to dig out, to reach the animals, to clear enough space to function. But the animals had survived, the cabin had held, and Evelyn and Ethan had weathered the storm together, emerging from it changed in ways neither of them could fully articulate. The work of survival consumed the following weeks, clearing snow, feeding animals, maintaining the fire, cooking, cleaning, repairing damage from the storm. There was no time for reading lessons, barely time to sleep. But they worked as a team now, anticipating each other's needs, moving with the kind of coordination that only comes from genuine partnership. When Evelyn's hands went numb from the cold, Ethan was there to warm them. When Ethan's shoulder seized up from old injury, Evelyn knew which herbs to brew to ease the pain. They'd become a unit, functioning better together than either could alone. Late one evening in February, as they sat by the fire after another exhausting day, a knock came at the door.
This story was posted on the channel
They'd
west
had
of
no
Betrayal.
visitors since the
Please
judge's
do not
night in
repost
November.
it in any
Out
form.
here, 10 miles from town in the dead of winter, visitors meant trouble. Ethan grabbed the rifle and moved to the door. "Who is it?" "William Carter." The voice was strained, exhausted. "I need to speak with my daughter. Please." Evelyn's heart lurched. She nodded at Ethan, who unbarred the door. Her father stumbled in, snow-covered and half-frozen, looking 10 years older than the last time she'd seen him. His clothes were travel-stained, his face gaunt with cold and something that looked like despair. "Evelyn," his voice cracked on her name. "Thank heaven. I wasn't sure you'd let me in." "What are you doing here?" She didn't move to embrace him, didn't offer comfort. "How did you even find this place?" "Asked in town, offered money. Someone told me the general direction." He swayed on his feet and Ethan caught his arm, guiding him to a chair by the fire. You rode out here in this weather? Ethan said, shaking his head. That's either brave or stupid, and I'm leaning towards stupid. I had to come. I had to see her, to explain. William stopped, his eyes finding Evelyn's face. To beg forgiveness, if there's any to be had. What happened? Evelyn asked, her voice carefully controlled. Has something gone wrong with the bank? The bank is fine. Thriving, actually, under the new management structure I put in place. He looked at his hands, unable to meet her eyes. Your mother returned from San Francisco last month. I told her everything about the debt, the forced marriage, how I sold you to save myself. And she left me. The words came out broken. Packed her things and moved to her sister's house. Said she couldn't look at me anymore, couldn't share a home with a man who'd trade his own daughter's happiness for financial security. She was right, of course. Everything she said was right. Evelyn felt a strange numbness settling over her. Why are you telling me this? Because I need you to know I understand what I did, that I'm not trying to justify it or excuse it. I destroyed your life to save my own reputation, and that's unforgivable. He finally looked up, and there were tears on his weathered face. But I also needed to see for myself that you're surviving out here, that you're safe. Safe? Evelyn laughed, a harsh sound. Is that what you call this? Being exiled to the frontier, forced into marriage with a stranger, living in a cabin smaller than my bedroom used to be? Yes, Father, I'm very safe. Evelyn, no. You don't get to come here and ease your conscience by checking on me. You don't get to see that I've survived and go back to town feeling better about what you did. She stood, her hands clenched at her sides. You want forgiveness? You want absolution? I don't have it to give, not yet. Maybe not ever. William flinched as if struck. I understand. I needed you to know that losing your mother made me realize what I'd actually lost. Not the bank, not my reputation. I lost my family, my daughter. Everything that actually mattered, I threw away to keep things that don't matter at all. That's a lesson you learned too late to help me. I know. He was crying openly now, this man who'd always prided himself on control. I know, and I'll carry that for the rest of my life. But I also wanted to tell you that if you need anything, money, supplies, a way out of this situation, I'll help however I can. No conditions, no expectations, just let me do something to make this even slightly less awful. Evelyn wanted to throw his offer back in his face, to send him out into the cold with nothing but her contempt for company. But Ethan's gentle pressure on her shoulder stopped her. You rode out here in dangerous conditions, Ethan said quietly. That took courage, even if it was courage born from guilt. At least stay until morning. Warm up, eat something. Don't kill yourself riding back in the dark. William looked at Ethan as if seeing him for the first time. You're Cole, the stable hand. I'm Evelyn's husband, Ethan corrected, his voice firm, and the owner of this land. The stable hand was who I used to be, not who I am now. Something shifted in William's expression. Recognition, perhaps, or respect. I apologize. I spoke carelessly. You did. But you're also half frozen and exhausted, so I'll let it pass this once. Ethan moved to the fire, adding wood. We don't have much, but we can offer you warm food and a place to sleep. In the morning, when everyone's thinking more clearly, you and Evelyn can talk if she wants to. Evelyn wanted to argue, but she was too tired. And underneath her anger, buried deep but still present, was something that might have been relief. Her father looked terrible, hollow and broken in a way she'd never seen. His suffering didn't erase what he'd done, didn't make her situation any less unjust, but it was something. An acknowledgement of wrongdoing, at least. They gave William the bed while they slept by the fire, and Evelyn found herself curled against Ethan's warmth, his arm around her shoulders, listening to her father's ragged breathing across the room. Are you all right? Ethan whispered. I don't know, she admitted. I've been so angry at him for so long, and I'm still angry. But seeing him like this, seeing what it's cost him, I don't know what I feel anymore. You don't have to figure it out tonight. Sometimes complicated feelings take time to sort through. When did you become so wise? Since I started reading philosophy and arguing with you about it. She felt him smile against her hair. You're rubbing off on me. Poor you. Best thing that ever happened to me, actually. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Evelyn didn't respond, but she moved closer and Ethan's arm tightened around her and they fell asleep that way. Partners, allies, and perhaps something more they weren't quite ready to name. Morning came cold and clear. William woke looking slightly more human, though the haunted expression hadn't left his eyes. Evelyn made breakfast while Ethan saw to the animals, the routine domestic task giving her hands something to do while her mind churned. When they finally sat down together, William spoke first. "I know you don't want to hear this, but I need to say it anyway. I was wrong. Not just wrong, morally bankrupt. I chose money and reputation over my own daughter's happiness, and there's no justification for that. None." He wrapped his hands around the coffee cup Evelyn had given him. "I came here partly to apologize, but also to offer what help I can. If you want to leave this place, I have money now, enough to set you up somewhere else, somewhere better. You could go to San Francisco with your mother, or east to New York, or anywhere you want to be. You don't have to stay trapped here." Evelyn opened her mouth to respond, but Ethan spoke first. "She's not trapped here," he said quietly. "She's free to leave anytime she wants. I've never stopped her, never would. If she wants to go with you, I won't stand in her way." William looked between them, clearly confused by the dynamic. "But you're married, legally bound." "Legal papers don't make a prison unless people choose to enforce them that way," Ethan replied. "Evelyn is her own person. If she wants to leave, she leaves. If she wants to stay, she stays. That's her choice, not mine to make for her." "You'd really let her go, just like that?" "Just like that." Ethan met Evelyn's eyes across the table. "I'd hate it. I'd miss her every day for the rest of my life. But I won't hold someone against their will. I know too well what that feels like." The room fell silent. William stared at Ethan as if he'd grown a second head. Evelyn felt her heart hammering in her chest. She could leave. Right now. Walk away from this cabin, this hard life, this frontier exile. Her father was offering her escape, offering her the life she'd lost, or at least some version of it. But as she looked around the small cabin, at the books stacked carefully on the shelves, at the table where they shared meals and reading lessons, at the fireplace that had kept them warm through brutal storms, at Ethan's quiet face waiting for her decision without pressure or manipulation, she realized something fundamental had changed. This wasn't a prison anymore. Maybe it had never been, except in her own mind. This was home, rough and difficult, and nothing like what she'd been raised to expect, but home nonetheless. And Ethan wasn't her jailer. He was her partner, her equal. The person who'd shown her kindness when he could have demanded obedience, who'd taught her to survive when he could have let her struggle, who'd become someone she respected and valued, and maybe even... "I'm staying," she heard herself say. William's cup froze halfway to his lips. "What?" "I'm staying, here, with Ethan." The words felt right in her mouth, true in a way few things had felt true since her wedding day. "I appreciate the offer, Father, I do. But this is my life now. I've built something here, learned things about myself I never would have discovered in Red Hollow. I'm not going back." "Evelyn, you don't have to be noble about this. You were forced into this marriage. I was. And I resented it every day for months. But that's not why I'm staying now." She looked at Ethan, saw the hope and fear warring in his expression. "I'm staying because I choose to. Because this life, hard as it is more honest than anything I had before. Because the man I'm married to treats me with more respect than anyone in your civilized town ever did. And because I'm not the banker's
This
daughter
story
anymore.
was posted on the
I'm
channel
Evelyn
West
Cole.
of Betrayal.
And Evelyn Cole
Please do not
belongs here."
repost it in any form.
The smile that spread across Ethan's face was like sunrise breaking over the frontier, slow, warm, transforming everything it touched. William slumped in his chair, looking older and sadder than ever. "I don't understand. How can you choose this over comfort, over society, over everything you had?" "Because everything I had was built on lies and conditional love," Evelyn said gently. "Out here, things are real. Difficult, yes. Sometimes brutal, but real. And I'd rather have a hard truth than a comfortable lie." Her father was quiet for a long time. Finally, he nodded, defeat and perhaps a kind of understanding in his eyes. "Then I'll respect your choice. Though it breaks my heart to think of you out here, struggling through winters and isolation." "I'm not struggling alone," Evelyn said, reaching across the table to take Ethan's hand. That makes all the difference. William left that afternoon, taking with him Evelyn's written letter to her mother and a promise that she would visit town in the spring when the roads cleared, but not to stay, just to visit. Because her home was here now, in this cabin on the frontier, with a man who'd proven that forced beginnings could still lead to chosen futures. As they watched her father's figure disappear into the distance, Ethan turned to Evelyn. Did you mean it? About choosing to stay? Every word. She looked up at him, at this man who'd become so much more than the stranger she'd been sold to. Did you mean what you said? About letting me go if I wanted to? Every word, he echoed, though I'm grateful beyond measure that you didn't want to. They stood together in the cold February afternoon, watching the empty horizon, and Evelyn realized that for the first time since her fall from grace, she felt something like peace, not happiness, not yet. There was still too much healing to be done, too many scars to fade, but peace. The quiet contentment of knowing she was exactly where she chose to be, with exactly the person she chose to be with. The frontier stretched out endlessly before them, harsh and beautiful, and utterly indifferent to their small drama. But they'd learned to survive it together, and in surviving, they'd built something that felt increasingly like the life they both wanted, rather than the punishment they'd both endured. Whatever came next, and there would be challenges, there would be hardships, because the frontier gave nothing freely. They would face it as partners, as equals, as two people who'd been forced together by cruelty but had chosen to stay together out of something infinitely more powerful. That night, curled together against the cold, Evelyn whispered into the darkness, "Thank you." For what? Ethan's voice was soft, already half asleep. For being patient, for being kind, for giving me time to see what was actually here instead of just what I'd lost. Thank you for staying, for teaching me, for choosing this. A pause. For choosing me. Evelyn closed her eyes, Ethan's steady heartbeat beneath her ear, and let herself feel the truth of her decision. She'd fallen from the heights of Red Hollow society into exile and hardship. But in falling, she'd discovered something she'd never had before. The freedom to choose her own life, to become her own person, to build something real with someone who saw her for who she actually was, rather than who society demanded she be. It wasn't the life she'd imagined, but increasingly, it was the life she wanted, and that, she was beginning to understand, made all the difference in the world. Spring came late to the frontier that year, arriving not with sudden warmth, but with a gradual thawing that turned the world to mud and slush. The snow retreated slowly, revealing brown grass and the skeletal remains of last year's garden. And with it came the realization that Evelyn and Ethan had survived their first winter together. More than survived. They'd built something neither of them had fully recognized until the worst of the cold had passed. The morning Evelyn woke to find the first green shoots pushing through the earth near the cabin, she felt something shift inside her chest. Hope, perhaps. Or possibility. The frontier was teaching her new languages, and this one spoke of renewal, of things that could grow even in harsh soil. "Look at this," she called to Ethan, who was repairing a fence post damaged by the freeze-thaw cycle. "The garden's coming back." He walked over, wiping his hands on his work trousers, and crouched beside her to examine the tiny shoots. "Those are the onions I planted last fall. Figured they were lost, but I guess they're tougher than I thought." He glanced at her, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Like someone else I know." "Are you calling me an onion?" "I'm calling you resilient." He stood, offering her a hand up. "I've been thinking, now that the weather's clearing, I want to expand the garden, plant more variety. Maybe even try some fruit trees if we can get saplings from town." "We?" Evelyn noticed the word, the assumption of partnership it carried. "We," Ethan confirmed, meeting her eyes. "Unless you'd rather I handle it alone?" "No." She brushed dirt from her hands, looking at the space he was indicating. "I'd like to help. I want to see what we can grow here." The word "we" had become natural to both of them now, slipping into their speech without conscious thought. They planned together, worked together, built their future together in small, deliberate increments that were transforming the cabin from a place of exile into something that felt genuinely like home. That afternoon, as Evelyn was kneading bread dough, a task she now performed with confident efficiency, Ethan came inside with a troubled expression. "There's a rider coming," he said, moving to where the rifle hung on the wall. "Too far to make out who yet, but someone's definitely heading this way." Evelyn's hand stilled in the dough. They'd had no visitors since her father's departure in February, and the memory of Judge Blackwell's men still made her skin crawl. "Should we bar the door?" "Let's see who it is first." Ethan positioned himself by the window, rifle in hand but not raised. Could be someone just passing through, needing directions. As the rider drew closer, Evelyn recognized the horse first, a chestnut mare from the stable in Red Hollow. Then the rider's posture, the set of her shoulders. "That's Martha," she said, moving to the door. "My father's housemaid." Ethan lowered the rifle as Martha pulled up in front of the cabin, her face flushed from the hard ride. She slid from the saddle with visible relief. Mrs. Cole," she corrected herself breathlessly. "Thank heaven I found you. I've been riding since dawn. What's wrong? Is it my father?" Evelyn's heart clenched with sudden fear. "Your father's fine. It's everything else." Martha accepted the water Ethan offered, drinking deeply before continuing. "There's been trouble in town, bad trouble. Judge Blackwell's been making moves against anyone he thinks crossed him, and your father's at the top of that list." "What kind of moves?" Ethan asked, his voice sharp. "Financial at first. The judge called in some old debts, tried to pressure your father into selling the bank. But Mr. Carter refused, said he'd already paid too high a price for that bank to hand it over now. So the judge changed tactics." Martha's hand shook as she set down the water cup. 3 days ago, Thomas Blackwell was found dead in his hotel room. The official story is he drank himself into a stupor and choked. But there are rumors. "What kind of rumors?" Evelyn felt ice settling in her stomach. "That someone helped him along, and the judge is saying your father had motive, revenge for what happened to you. He's calling for an investigation, stirring up sentiment against Mr. Carter, making it sound like he's a murderer." Martha looked at Evelyn with desperate eyes. "Your father didn't do it. I'd stake my life on that. But the judge has influence, and people are starting to listen. I came to warn you because if the judge can destroy your father, he won't stop there. He'll come after you too, find some way to punish you for existing." Ethan and Evelyn exchanged a long look, an entire conversation passing between them in silence. They'd built something fragile and precious here, a life away from Red Hollow's politics and cruelty. But the past, it seemed, wasn't content to leave them alone. "We have to go back," Evelyn said quietly. "Don't we?" "We don't have to do anything," Ethan replied, but there was resignation in his voice. "But if we want to stop this, if we want to protect your father and end the judge's hold over us once and for all, then yes, we probably need to go back." Martha stayed the night, too exhausted from her ride to return immediately. Over dinner, she filled in more details: the mood in town, the alliances forming and breaking, the fear that permeated everything now that Thomas was dead, and the judge's grief had turned into something dark and vengeful. "He's not even pretending to be rational anymore," Martha said, her voice low. "He ranted in the street yesterday about how his son was destroyed by pride and arrogance, about how the Carter family needed to pay for their sins. It was frightening, Mrs. Cole, like watching someone come completely unhinged." That night, Evelyn lay awake long after Ethan's breathing had steadied into sleep. Going back to Red Hollow meant confronting everything she'd fled from: the judgment, the shame, the people who'd watched her fall with undisguised satisfaction.
This story was posted on the
But it
channel
also meant
west
the chance
of
to
Betrayal.
end this cycle of
Please
revenge
do not
and
repost
manipulation,
it in any
to face
form.
Judge Blackwell not as a powerless victim, but as someone who'd survived his worst punishment and emerged stronger for it. She must have eventually slept because she woke to find Ethan already up, packing supplies with methodical efficiency. "You decided," she observed, sitting up. "We decided," he corrected. "Last night, without words. I could see it in your eyes. You're not going to let your father face this alone. And I'm not going to let you face it alone. So we're going back together. You don't have to come. This isn't your fight. It became my fight the moment Judge Blackwell used me as a weapon against you." Ethan's jaw was set, determined. "Besides, I've been thinking about what you said once, about how the frontier teaches you what you're made of. Well, I think it's time Red Hollow learned what we're both made of now." They left at first light, Martha leading the way back to town on her chestnut mare, while Evelyn and Ethan followed on their best horses. The journey that had seemed endless when Evelyn first made it in October now felt almost short. The landscape familiar rather than alien, the hardship manageable rather than overwhelming. They reached Red Hollow just before sunset, the town appearing on the horizon like a ghost from another life. Evelyn felt her stomach clench as they rode down Main Street, acutely aware of the eyes watching from windows and doorways, the whispers that followed in their wake. "Is that Evelyn Carter? I heard she'd gone completely wild out there on the frontier. Look at her, dressed like a common laborer. How the mighty have fallen." Ethan reached over and took her hand, a gesture of solidarity that spoke louder than any words. They rode through the gauntlet of judgment together, heads high, until they reached the Carter house. William opened the door before they could knock, his face transforming from worry to relief to something like wonder as he took in their appearance, windburned and road-weary, dressed in practical frontier clothing, but standing together with an unmistakable unity. "Evelyn, Mr. Cole." He stepped back to let them enter. "Martha got through, thank heaven." "We heard about Thomas," Evelyn said, moving into the familiar parlor that now seemed too ornate, too frivolous after months in the cabin's simplicity. "And about the judge's accusations. Tell us everything." Over the next hour, William laid out the situation in grim detail. Thomas Blackwell had indeed died under suspicious circumstances, but William had an alibi. He'd been at a banking conference in Sacramento at the time, with dozens of witnesses. Nevertheless, Judge Blackwell was using his influence to paint a picture of conspiracy, suggesting William had hired someone to do the deed. "The truth is," William said heavily, "Thomas drank himself to death, just like his mother did years ago. It's a family curse the judge refuses to acknowledge. But admitting that would mean admitting his son was weak, flawed, not the perfect heir he pretended to be. So instead, he needs someone to blame. And I'm convenient." "What about the law? Surely there are legal processes, appeals," Evelyn began, but her father cut her off with a bitter laugh. "The judge is the law in Red Hollow. Every lawyer, every official, everyone with power is either in his pocket or afraid of him. I could fight this for years and never win, because the system is designed to protect men like him and destroy men like me." "Then we need to change the system," Ethan said quietly. Both Carters turned to look at him. "Or at least expose it for what it is. Make the judge's corruption so public, so undeniable, that people can't ignore it anymore." "How do you propose we do that?" William asked, skepticism evident in his tone. "I don't know yet." Ethan met his gaze steadily. "But I know that bullies like Judge Blackwell rely on people being too afraid to stand up to them. Maybe it's time someone stopped being afraid." That night, sleeping in her old bedroom for the first time since October, Evelyn found herself unable to rest. The bed was too soft, the room too quiet after months of sharing the cabin with Ethan and falling asleep to the sound of his breathing. She rose and found him on the parlor sofa, similarly sleepless. "Can't rest either?" she asked, sitting beside him. "Too many ghosts in this house. Too many memories of who we used to be." He looked at her in the dim light. "Do you miss it? This life?" "No." The answer came without hesitation. "I thought I would. Thought coming back here would make me realize what I'd lost, make me regret choosing the frontier, but instead, I just feel disconnected, like this was someone else's life, not mine." "I know what you mean. I've been thinking about the first time I saw you, in this house actually, when I delivered horses to the stable. You were on the porch, dressed in some fancy gown, laughing with friends. You looked like you belonged to another world entirely, untouchable and perfect." He smiled slightly. "I never imagined I'd end up married to you, much less that I'd prefer the real you to that perfect image. The real me is stubborn and argumentative and still learning how to cook without burning things. The real you is strong and resilient and brave enough to build a new life from nothing. The real you is the woman I—" He stopped, the unfinished sentence hanging between them. "The woman you what?" Evelyn's heart was pounding. Ethan turned to face her fully, his winter sky eyes serious in the low light. "The woman I love. I know that probably complicates everything, and I don't expect you to feel the same way, but I can't keep pretending my feelings are just partnership or friendship or gratitude for the reading lessons. I love you, Evelyn. I have for weeks now, maybe longer. I love your sharp tongue and your determination and the way you refuse to quit even when everything's stacked against you. I love the person you've become out there on the frontier, and I love that I got to witness that transformation." The words settled over Evelyn like a blessing she hadn't known she needed. "I love you too," she whispered, the admission feeling both terrifying and absolutely right. I don't know exactly when it happened, maybe during the January storm or during the reading lessons or one of the 100 small moments in between. But somewhere along the way, you stopped being the stranger I was forced to marry and became the person I choose to be with, the person I trust, the person I love. Ethan cupped her face in his calloused hands, his touch gentle despite his strength. "Is it all right if I kiss you? Really kiss you? Not as obligation or pretense, but because we both want to?" "Yes," Evelyn breathed, and then his lips were on hers, and the kiss was everything their marriage had never been. Chosen, genuine, full of promise and possibility, and the kind of tenderness that came from truly knowing another person. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Ethan rested his forehead against hers. "Whatever happens with the judge, whatever we face tomorrow, we face it together. As partners. As people who choose each other." "Together," Evelyn agreed. "Always." The next morning, they woke with new determination. If Judge Blackwell wanted a fight, they'd give him one, but not on his terms, not playing by rules designed to ensure his victory. "We need allies," Evelyn said over breakfast with her father. "People in town who've been hurt by the judge, who have reason to want to see his power broken." "There are plenty of those," William replied, "but they're all too afraid to speak up. The judge has crushed everyone who's ever opposed him." "Then we need to make them less afraid." Ethan leaned forward, his expression intense. "What if we gave them cover? Safety in numbers. One person speaking against the judge gets destroyed, but 10 people? 20? 50? You're talking about organizing resistance against the most powerful man in the territory," William said slowly. "That's dangerous, possibly deadly. Living under his thumb for the rest of our lives is also deadly, just slower." Evelyn looked at her father. "You said you'd lost everything that mattered trying to appease him. Here's your chance to fight back. Are you willing?" William Carter sat in silence for a long moment, and Evelyn could see the man he'd been, weak, afraid, willing to sacrifice his daughter to save himself, warring with the man he wanted to become. Finally, he nodded. "Yes, I'm willing. Tell me what you need." Over the following days, they worked quietly but purposefully. William used his banking connections to identify people with grievances against the judge, merchants who'd been forced to sell property below value, families who'd lost loved ones in suspicious accidents after crossing Judge Blackwell, workers who'd been cheated of wages and threatened into silence. Evelyn, meanwhile, discovered an unexpected ally in the most unlikely place. While visiting the general store for supplies, she encountered Sarah Chen, the widow who ran the seamstress shop across the street. "Mrs. Cole," Sarah said, using Evelyn's married name without hesitation or mockery. "I heard you were back in town. I wanted to tell you, what the judge did to you was wrong. What he's doing to your father is wrong. And if there's anything I can do to help, you have my support." "Thank you," Evelyn said, surprised by the woman's directness. "May I ask why? Most people in this town seem content to let the judge do as he pleases." "Because he did the same thing to me 5 years ago. My husband owned a freight business that the judge wanted. When we refused to sell, suddenly there were accidents. Wagons losing wheels, horses going lame, shipments being misplaced.
This story
My
was
husband
posted on the
confronted the
channel
judge,
west of
and a
Betrayal.
week later he was dead.
Please do not
Kicked
repost
by a horse,
it in any
they said.
form.
But I know better." Sarah's eyes were hard with old pain. "I've been waiting for someone brave enough to challenge him. I think that someone might be you." By the end of the week, they'd quietly assembled a group of 23 people, a mix of merchants, laborers, widows, and dispossessed former landowners, all with stories of how Judge Blackwell had abused his power. Ethan suggested they meet at the cabin, far from the judge's ears and eyes, and they made the journey on a Sunday afternoon when their absence from town would be less noticeable. Standing in front of the assembled group in the space between the cabin and the barn, Evelyn felt a surge of something she hadn't experienced since before her fall: purpose. But this was different from the shallow purpose of maintaining social standing. This was real, meaningful, the kind of purpose that came from fighting for something larger than yourself. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice carrying across the quiet gathering. "I know it wasn't easy, and I know it's risky, but I also know that each of you is here because Judge Blackwell has hurt you or someone you love. He's used his power not to uphold justice, but to serve his own interests, and he's gotten away with it because people were too afraid to stand together against him." "What can we do?" asked a grizzled rancher whose land the judge had seized on dubious legal grounds. "He owns the law. He owns the courts. He owns this whole damn territory." "He owns the system as it currently exists," Ethan said, stepping forward. "But systems can be changed, laws can be challenged, and power that depends on fear and isolation can be broken by truth and solidarity." They spent the next several hours planning, strategizing, building a case not just against Judge Blackwell's corruption in general, but against his specific abuses of each person in the room. William, drawing on his banking expertise, helped them document every shady land deal, every manipulated debt, every suspicious death that had followed an act of defiance. "We're building a record," he explained, "something so detailed and undeniable that even the judge's allies will have trouble ignoring it. And we're going to send it to the territorial governor, to newspapers in Sacramento and San Francisco, to anyone with the power to investigate." "The judge will retaliate," Sarah warned. "The moment he finds out what we're doing, he'll come after all of us." "Then we make sure we're too many to destroy all at once," Evelyn said. "We stand together, support each other, and make our voices heard in unison. He can't silence all of us without revealing himself for the tyrant he is." Over the following weeks, their coalition grew. More people came forward with stories, with evidence, with a willingness to finally speak truth to power. The cabin became a gathering place, a neutral ground where Red Hollow's oppressed could organize beyond the judge's reach. And through it all, Evelyn and Ethan worked side by side, their partnership deepening with each challenge they faced. They discovered something powerful, that a marriage forced by cruelty could become a partnership forged in purpose, and that love born from mutual respect was stronger than any founded on social expectation. The confrontation came on a warm day in late April. Judge Blackwell, having finally caught wind of the organizing happening beyond his control, called a town meeting to address the slander and conspiracy being conducted against him. What he didn't know was that Evelyn and her coalition had been waiting for exactly this opportunity. The town hall was packed when they arrived, not just with the judge's supporters, but with the 23 original members of the coalition and the 50-plus people who'd joined them since. They filled the back half of the room, a silent wall of witnesses and accusers. Judge Blackwell stood at the front, his face red with barely controlled rage. "We're here to address the malicious lies being spread about me and my family. Lies being perpetuated by those who seek to profit from chaos and disorder. The only lies being told are yours, Judge." Evelyn's voice rang out clear and strong as she stood. Every eye in the room turned to her. "And we have the documentation to prove it." "You dare!" the judge sputtered, but Evelyn cut him off. "I dare because you can't silence all of us anymore. I dare because you used your power to force me into exile, to threaten my family, to punish me for the crime of refusing your son. I dare because every person in the back half of this room has a story like mine, of land stolen, debts manipulated, loved ones mysteriously dead after crossing you, and we're done being afraid." William stood next, holding up a thick folder of documents. "These are the records of your corruption, Judge Blackwell. Every illegal land seizure, every manipulated contract, every suspicious death that coincidentally benefited your interests. Copies have already been sent to the territorial governor, to 3 newspapers, and to a lawyer in Sacramento who specializes in corruption cases. The investigation has already begun. Your power ends today." The judge's face went from red to purple. "This is outrageous. These are lies fabricated by bitter people who—" "Then explain this." Sarah Chen stood, her voice shaking but determined. "This is the contract you forced my husband to sign before he died. The one that gave you control of his freight business for a fraction of its value. The one you claimed was legitimate until I found the original version with different terms. You forged this document, Judge. You're not just corrupt, you're a criminal." One by one, members of the coalition stood and spoke, each adding their voice to the chorus of accusation. The judge tried to shout them down, to assert his authority. but his voice was drowned out by the sheer number of people refusing to be silent anymore. Finally, when the last testimony had been given and the room was buzzing with shocked conversation, Ethan stood. "I'm nobody important," he said, his voice calm but carrying. "Just a man who used to clean stables and lived alone on the frontier. But even I can see that what's been happening in Red Hollow isn't justice, it's tyranny. You used your power not to serve the people, but to control them. You forced a woman into marriage with me as punishment for refusing your son. You've destroyed lives, broken families, and corrupted every institution meant to protect people from men exactly like you." He looked directly at Judge Blackwell, his winter sky eyes hard as stone. "You thought you were punishing Evelyn by giving her to me. You thought you were humiliating us both. But all you did was show us what we're capable of when we stopped being afraid of you. You made us stronger, and now that strength is going to be your downfall." The judge tried to rally his supporters, tried to call for order, tried to reassert control, but the damage was done. Too many people had heard too much truth, and when the territorial governor's representatives arrived 2 days later to begin a formal investigation, they found a town ready to testify. The legal process took months. Judge Blackwell was removed from the bench pending investigation, then formally charged with corruption, forgery, and conspiracy to commit fraud. His assets were frozen, his power dismantled piece by piece. He raged and threatened, but without his position, his threats were empty. Thomas's death was eventually ruled accidental, as everyone who'd actually known him understood it to be. The tragic end of a man who'd drunk himself into oblivion trying to escape his father's impossible expectations. It was sad, but it wasn't murder, and William was fully exonerated. Through it all, Evelyn and Ethan remained in Red Hollow, supporting the transition, helping their coalition members recover what had been stolen, witnessing the slow transformation of a town emerging from under a tyrant's thumb. But they didn't stay. When the worst of the chaos had settled and Red Hollow began the work of rebuilding under fair governance, Evelyn and Ethan returned to their cabin on the frontier. They'd proven what they needed to prove, fought the fight that needed fighting. Now it was time to go home. The cabin looked different when they returned in early summer, or perhaps they looked at it differently. The garden Evelyn had planted was flourishing, green shoots turning into vegetables and herbs. The barn Ethan had repaired stood solid and weatherproof. The 40 acres of hard-won land stretched out around them, no longer a prison, but a foundation upon which to build whatever future they chose. "I've been thinking," Ethan said one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. "About what you said once, about wanting purpose, about wanting to do something meaningful. What about it? There are people out here, scattered across the frontier, who can't read or write, who don't have access to education because they're too far from town or too poor to afford it. What if we taught them? What if we turned this place into something more than just a homestead, made it a place where people could come to learn?" Evelyn turned to look at him, excitement kindling in her chest. "You want to start a school?" "Not a formal one, necessarily. Just a place where people can come if they want to learn. You could teach reading, writing, literature. I could teach practical skills, farming, building, surviving out here. We could offer what we both know to people who need it." The vision took shape in Evelyn's mind. Neighbors from distant homesteads gathering at the cabin, children learning their letters, adults discovering the worlds contained in books. It wasn't the life of social prominence she'd been raised to expect, but it was something infinitely more valuable, a life of genuine purpose and impact. "I love it," she said. "Let's do it." They started small. A few neighboring families, word spreading slowly across
This story
the
was
scattered frontier
posted on the
community.
channel west of
Evelyn
Betrayal.
taught reading and writing
Please do not
3 afternoons
repost
a
it
week,
in any
while
form.
Ethan held sessions on practical homesteading skills. The cabin became a gathering place, a center of learning and community in a landscape that could be brutally isolating. As summer turned to autumn, their little school grew. People traveled hours to attend lessons, hungry for knowledge and connection. Evelyn discovered she had a gift for teaching, for making complex ideas accessible, for inspiring in others the same love of learning that had sustained her through her darkest days. Ethan thrived too, his natural leadership and practical wisdom making him a respected figure among the frontier families. But more than that, he continued his own education, reading voraciously, writing increasingly sophisticated essays and observations, transforming himself from the barely literate stable hand he'd been into a genuine intellectual. One crisp October evening, exactly 1 year after their forced wedding, Evelyn and Ethan sat together by the fire, watching the flames dance as wind howled outside. "Do you ever regret it?" Ethan asked quietly. "Choosing to stay? Choosing this life?" Evelyn considered the question seriously, thinking about everything that had happened in the past year. The humiliation of her fall from grace, the bitter anger of those first weeks, the gradual transformation as she learned to survive, learned to see Ethan clearly, learned to build something new from the ruins of what had been taken from her. "Not for a moment," she said honestly. "This life is harder than what I had before. The work is endless, the isolation can be crushing, and I'll never have the comfort or security I was raised to expect. But I'm more myself now than I ever was in Red Hollow. I'm more genuine, more purposeful, more alive. I'm exactly where I choose to be, with exactly who I choose to be with. How could I regret that?" "I love you," Ethan said, not for the first time, but with the same wonder as if it were. "I love you for your strength, your courage, your refusal to be broken by what was done to you. I love that you took a situation meant to destroy you and turned it into something beautiful." "We turned it into something beautiful," Evelyn corrected, taking his hand. "Together, neither of us could have done this alone." "Together," Ethan agreed, pulling her close. "Always together." As winter approached again, they prepared with the confidence of experience rather than the fear of the unknown. They'd survived one brutal frontier winter and emerged stronger. They could survive anything now. Their school continued to grow. By December, they were teaching over 30 students ranging from children to grandparents, all hungry for knowledge and community. The cabin had become too small, so Ethan built an addition with help from the fathers of his students, a larger room that could serve as a proper classroom. Word spread beyond their immediate area. People from Red Hollow began making the journey to attend lessons, drawn by Evelyn's reputation as a teacher and Ethan's growing renown as a practical philosopher who understood frontier life in all its complexity. Judge Blackwell, meanwhile, had been convicted and sentenced to prison for his crimes. His empire of corruption dismantled, his reputation destroyed, his power reduced to nothing. Evelyn felt no satisfaction in his downfall, only a quiet relief that his ability to hurt people had finally ended. Her father visited regularly now, having sold the bank and retired to a smaller, simpler life. He and Evelyn had achieved a careful reconciliation, not forgetting what he'd done but finding a way to move forward. He often helped with the school, teaching basic mathematics and business principles to the older students. "I'm proud of you," he told Evelyn one afternoon, watching her lead a discussion about literature with a group of rapt students. "Prouder than I ever was when you were the perfect banker's daughter in Red Hollow. You've built something real here, something that matters." "Thank you, Father," Evelyn said, and meant it. His approval no longer defined her, but it was still gratifying to receive. Victoria, Evelyn's mother, never visited the frontier. She'd made her peace with her daughter through letters, but couldn't reconcile herself to the rough life Evelyn had chosen. That was all right. Some relationships could be maintained at a distance, honored without requiring proximity. As their second winter together approached, Evelyn stood on the porch of the cabin-turned-schoolhouse, looking out at the landscape that had once seemed so alien and hostile. Now it felt like home in a way Red Hollow never had, not because it was comfortable or easy, but because everything here was real and chosen and earned through effort. Ethan joined her, wrapping an arm around her waist, and together they watched the sun set over their 40 acres of hard-won land. "Do you remember what you told me once?" Evelyn asked. "About how the frontier teaches you what you're made of?" "I remember. You were right. But it's more than that. The frontier doesn't just reveal what you're made of. It gives you the chance to become something new, to shed the person everyone expected you to be and discover who you actually are beneath all those expectations." "And who are you, Evelyn Cole?" She smiled, leaning into his warmth. "I'm a teacher, a partner, a woman who learned that falling from grace can be the beginning of rising to something better. I'm someone who chose love over comfort, purpose over security, authenticity over approval. I'm exactly who I was meant to be, even if I had to lose everything to find her." "I know the feeling," Ethan said softly. "I spent my whole life being told I was nothing, just a laborer, just a stable hand, not worthy of respect or education or love." Then you came into my life and showed me I could be more. That I was already more, I just needed someone to see it. We saw each other, Evelyn said. Past the circumstances, past the labels, past everything that was supposed to define us. We saw who we actually were, and we chose to build something together based on that truth. As darkness settled over the frontier, they went inside to their home, a place that had started as a prison and become a sanctuary, a classroom, a foundation for a life neither of them could have imagined but both had worked to create. Their story had begun with humiliation and coercion, with a proud woman's fall and a desperate man's compromise. But it hadn't ended there. Through patience and kindness, through mutual respect and shared purpose, through the daily choice to treat each other with dignity despite the indignity of their forced beginning, they'd transformed something ugly into something beautiful. They'd proven that forced beginnings didn't have to determine final destinations. That cruelty could be overcome by choosing kindness. That two people trapped by circumstance could free each other through understanding and love. The frontier had tested them. Winter had nearly broken them, and society had tried to shame them. But they'd survived it all and emerged not just intact but transformed, stronger, wiser, more genuinely themselves than they'd ever been in their previous lives. Years later, when people asked Evelyn about her fall from Red Hollow society, she would smile and correct them. It hadn't been a fall, she'd explain. It had been a liberation. The loss of everything she thought mattered had freed her to discover what actually did. And when they asked if she'd ever regretted the forced marriage that had sent her to the frontier, she'd take Ethan's hand and answer with absolute certainty, not for one single moment. Because that marriage, as terrible as its beginning was, gave me the greatest gift I've ever received, the chance to choose my own life, to become my own person, and to find a partner who sees me for exactly who I am and loves me anyway. Their school continued to flourish, growing into an institution that served the entire frontier region. Evelyn and Ethan became respected figures in the territory, known not for their past humiliations, but for their present contributions, the lives they'd changed through education, the community they'd built through dedication, the example they'd set of what was possible when people chose authenticity over appearance. The cabin where it all began remained the heart of their operation, a symbol of transformation and resilience. And every evening, as the sun set over the endless frontier, Evelyn and Ethan would sit together and reflect on the journey that had brought them from desperation to purpose, from coercion to choice, from strangers forced together by cruelty to partners bound by love. They'd started with nothing but bitterness and obligation. They'd built everything that mattered through patience, partnership, and the revolutionary act of treating each other with dignity when the world expected degradation. And in the end, that made all the difference. Their story wasn't about a woman who fell from grace. It was about two people who rose from humiliation to build something greater than either could have achieved alone. It was about the power of choice, the strength of genuine partnership, and the transformative possibilities that exist even in the darkest circumstances. It was about love, not the easy kind born from perfect conditions, but the harder, deeper kind that's chosen daily despite imperfect beginnings. The kind that changes people, that builds communities, that proves human dignity and kindness can triumph over cruelty and manipulation. And it was about home. Not a place you're born to, but one you build through effort and intention, one choice at a time, one day at a time, until the life you've created is more real and more valuable than any life you lost. This was their legacy. This was their truth. And this was their hard-won, deeply earned, completely chosen happiness.